Come, settle in. Let the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. Let your breathing slow and allow yourself to be carried gently and without effort back across an enormous distance of time, back through the centuries and the millennia to a world that existed so long ago that even its memory has become something like a dream, something flickering at the very edge of what we can know and what we can only imagine. Tonight, we begin a long and unhurried journey together through one of the oldest and most beautiful stories the human imagination has ever produced. And there is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do except to rest here and listen. And if you find that these stories become a companion to your nights, a quiet voice that meets you at the end of each day and carries you towards sleep, there is a soft and simple way to make sure you can always find your way back here. A subscription, wherever you listen, costs nothing and asks nothing of you except a single tap. And it means these stories will be waiting for you, night after night, like a lamp left on in a window. And one more small and lovely thing. Somewhere in the world tonight, in rooms very different from yours, other quiet and sleepless people are listening to this same voice. And if you feel moved to leave a comment saying where in the world we're listening from, you join a gentle and scattered community of nighttime wanderers, resting together across continents and time zones, which is a beautiful thing to belong to. But now, let us go back. Let us go a very long way back. Imagine a sea, and let that sea be the first thing you hold in your mind as you close your eyes. It is not the gray and churning ocean of colder latitudes, not the fierce and featureless deep of the open Atlantic. It is a smaller sea, a more intimate sea, a sea that seems almost to have been designed for human beings to live beside and move across. It is hemmed in on all sides by land, by the long rocky coasts of what we now call Greece to the west, by the shores of what we now call Turkey to the east, by the great curve of the northern coastline where mountains descend in long green folds toward the water, and by the sun-bleached islands of the southern approaches, scattered across the surface like stepping stones placed there by some generous and unhurried hand. This is the Aegean Sea, and in the long light of the Bronze Age, somewhere in the centuries that stretched between roughly 3,000 and roughly 1,200 years before the birth of Christ, it was the center of a world, warm and ancient and alive. Homer, the poet to whom we owe the story we are beginning tonight, called this sea wine dark, and that phrase has puzzled and enchanted scholars for thousands of years. Wine dark. Not blue, not green, not gray, though the Aegean is all of these things at different hours. Wine dark, perhaps, in the way the sea looks in the deep hours of late afternoon, when the sun has dropped low and the water takes on a richness, a depth of color, something almost purple, something that holds the light the way a liquid holds warmth. Or perhaps Homer meant something about the character of the sea, something intoxicating and ancient and slightly dangerous, something that fills those who encounter it with a feeling they cannot quite name or put down. Whatever he meant, the phrase is right. You know it is right, even if you cannot say exactly why. Along the shores of this wine-dark sea, in the centuries that concern us, there were people living lives of considerable complexity and sophistication. People whose existence we once barely suspected and who were revealed to us only in the last century and a half through the slow and careful work of archaeologists, pressing their brushes gently against the soil. On the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization had already reached its extraordinary height and begun its long, mysterious decline. Its great palace at Knossos, with its labyrinthine corridors and its vivid painted walls, its dolphins leaping in blue fresco light, its storerooms stacked with enormous clay jars of oil and grain and wine, had been the center of a world unto itself, and the echoes of that world still moved through the culture of the Aegean like the last ripples after a stone has sunk. On the Greek mainland, in the centuries that our story most closely inhabits, it was the Mycenaean civilization that held sway, and when we say that name, Mycenaean, we are speaking of something that was itself only a name in legend for a very long time, a name attached to impossible golden things mentioned in old poems, until the excavators came and found the shaft graves and the golden masks, and the palaces standing on their high rocky ridges above the sea, and the world understood that the legends had been, in their way, telling the truth all along. Mycenae itself, perched on its formidable hill in the northeastern Peloponnese, was a city of walls so massive, so constructed of stones so enormous, that later Greeks who came upon their ruins believed they could only have been built by giants, and they called that style of construction Cyclopean, because only the one-eyed Cyclopes, they reasoned, could have moved such weight. The Lion Gate of Mycenae still stands today, two great lionesses carved in relief above the threshold, watching over everyone who passes beneath, as they have watched for more than 3,000 years. But Mycenae was not alone. This was a world of palaces, plural, a world of competing and cooperating centers of power, arranged around the Aegean's shores and islands, like candles set at intervals around a dark room. There was Tiryns, close to Mycenae, its walls even more massive in proportion, a palace fortress of such thick stone corridors that walking through them even now produces something close to awe. There was Pylos on the western coast, the palace of the legendary Nestor, and at Pylos archaeologists found not only the palace itself, but thousands of clay tablets covered in a script called Linear B, which turned out to be an early form of Greek, an administrative language used by palace scribes to record the movement of goods and animals and people, the everyday business of a Bronze Age kingdom. So many jars of honey, so many rams, so many rowers to be assigned to ships. It is the most ordinary kind of record keeping, and yet reading it or reading about it, one feels the presence of real people, people with names and tasks and daily concerns, people who lived and breathed and went home to their families at the end of the working day in a world that would otherwise be entirely silent to us. And across the water on the eastern shore of the Aegean, on the northwestern tip of the peninsula we now call Turkey or Anatolia, there was Troy. There was genuinely and truly a Troy. Or rather, there were many Troys, one built upon the ruins of another over the course of centuries, each city rising on the bones of its predecessor, like a slow geological accumulation of human effort. The archaeologists found them, layer after layer, descending into the earth, like the pages of an immense and largely illegible book. The Troy that concerns us, the Troy of the late Bronze Age, the city of Priam and Hector and the long siege, was a prosperous place, well situated to control the trade routes that passed through the narrow strait of the Hellespont, the waterway that connects the Aegean to the Black Sea, and prosperity and position have always made cities worth fighting over. The people who lived in all of these places, in the palaces and the harbors, in the fishing villages strung along rocky coastlines, in the workshops where bronze was hammered into weapons and tools, in the kitchens where bread was baked and oil was pressed and wine was poured into the deep cups that have survived in their thousands in museums around the world. These people looked up at the same sky we look up at tonight, the same stars arranged in the same patterns, and they told each other stories about the world and about the gods who moved through it, and about the heroes who lived at the great hinge point between the human and the divine. They were, in all the ways that matter, recognizably human. They loved their children and feared death and looked out at the sea and felt something that had no name, something between longing and wonder and the simple satisfaction of being alive in a world that was, most of the time, very beautiful. This is the world into which our story is born. And tomorrow night, if you return here and let yourself grow still again, we will move a little closer to the sea itself, down from the palace heights and onto the docks and the beaches, into the salt-smelling life of the sailors and traders and coastal people whose ships cross these dark waters day after day, carrying oil and bronze and wine and cloth and stories, always stories from one shore to another. For now, though, let the wine-dark sea rest at the edge of your awareness, its soft and rhythmic sound moving in and out like breath, and let yourself sink a little deeper into the quiet. You have nowhere to go. The smell of salt comes before everything else. It arrives on the wind long before you reach the water, threading itself through the dry scrub and sun-warmed stone of the hillside, a clean and ancient smell that has no beginning and no ending, that simply is, as the sea itself simply is, present and enormous and indifferent to the small human lives that move along its edges. And those lives did move, ceaselessly, seasonally, with a rhythm as steady and as natural as breathing, across the Bronze Age Mediterranean world in the centuries before the Great War at Troy, in an age when the sea was not a barrier between peoples, but the very road along which civilization traveled, carrying its gods and its grain and its copper and its stories from one bright harbor to the next. Picture the eastern Mediterranean on a morning in what we would call the late second millennium before the birth of Christ. Though the people living then had no such name for their time, knowing only the king's reign, the season's turn, the last good harvest, and the one before that. The sun is still low, a pale and watery gold, and the harbors are already alive. Along the Aegean coast, along shores that would one day bear the names of Greece and Turkey, and many other names still to come, small communities of fisher people and traders and craftsmen are beginning their days in the ways that communities have always begun their days, with fire lit against the morning cool, with water drawn, with bread broken and shared between people who know each other's faces and have known them since childhood. The boats pulled up on the beach in the gray hour before dawn are of many kinds. There are simple fishing craft, long and narrow, built for quick work close to shore, their hulls darkened with pitch and salt and years of service, their oars stacked neatly along their interiors, the way a craftsman stacks his tools at day's end. And then there are the larger vessels, the merchant ships that move the wealth of the ancient world from port to port, broad-bellied and deep, built to carry weight rather than speed, leaning into the water with the comfortable solidity of something made for patient labor. A ship of this kind might carry copper ingots from the island of Cyprus, great flat-cast slabs of the metal shaped, it is said, like an ox hide, spread for drying, heavy and reddish, and immensely valuable in a world where bronze, copper mixed with tin, was the material from which all tools and weapons and vessels of consequence were made. That same ship might also carry fine pottery from the mainland workshops, oil stored in tall, narrow jars sealed with clay and cloth, grain in hemp sacks that smelled of dust and earth and distant fields, and perhaps tucked carefully among the cargo, small luxury objects, carved ivory, faience beads of brilliant blue and green, a bolt of dyed cloth in a color so deep and vivid that it seemed almost impossible, the kind of color that made people stop and stare. The sailors who crewed these vessels were not so different, in their daily human texture, from sailors in any age. They were men, and it was almost always men on the open water, though the women waiting in the harbors held their own particular expertise and authority, who had grown up watching the sea and learning its moods the way a farmer learns the moods of the sky. They knew the winds by feel and by name, knew the way certain cloud formations gathering over a distant headland meant it was time to make for shore, knew the look of shallow water from the color of the surface above it, a subtle lightening, a slight translucence that no chart could teach and only years of watching could instill. Navigation in this world was a matter of memory and observation, of following coastlines where possible, and reading the stars when the open sea could not be avoided, of knowing which currents ran in which directions in which months, and trusting that knowledge with one's life, which is precisely what one did. Life aboard a merchant vessel was close and spare. The crew would have slept where they could, tucked between cargo or curled beneath a stretched hide when the weather turned cold, eating simply, dried fish, hard bread, perhaps olives carried in a small clay vessel that one man kept for himself the way people keep small comforts. Water drawn from the last port and stored carefully, rationed with the kind of unconscious precision that becomes habit. When the wind was favorable, they raised a single square sail, a great rectangle of woven cloth that filled with something like satisfaction when it caught, and the work of rowing was put aside, and men could rest, trailing their hands in the water, or watching the coast slide past, or simply closing their eyes and letting the movement of the hull speak to them in its low, continuous, wordless language. In harbor, everything changed. The harbor was the world's crossroads, the place where the careful boundaries of daily life opened into something wider and more unexpected. Merchants from different cities and different islands, and in the great cosmopolitan ports that archaeological evidence suggests were thriving along the eastern Mediterranean in this age, different continents altogether might find themselves anchored side by side, trading not only goods but words, gestures, names of gods and kings, rumors about wars far to the east or famines far to the south. It is said that the palace records of this era, those careful clay tablets preserved by the accident of their own baking in the fires that eventually destroyed the palaces that kept them, show evidence of trade networks of astonishing reach, of goods moving from Egypt to the Aegean, to Anatolia, to the Levant, and back again in patterns of commerce that suggest a world far more interconnected, than we sometimes imagine when we think of antiquity. The coastal communities that lived alongside this traffic were shaped by it in the deepest ways. A harbor town in the Bronze Age Aegean was a place where the local and the foreign existed in constant, mostly peaceful proximity. There were permanent residents, the potters and the smiths and the weavers, and the women who ground grain in stone basins, the children who ran barefoot on the hot stone quays and knew the names of every sailor who came regularly and invented names for the ones they did not know. And there were the transient visitors, the ships that stayed for a day or a week before the wind or the season called them onward. And, between these groups, there passed a continuous, unhurried exchange. Food and water and rope and pitch offered in exchange for goods, for news, for the small ceremonies of hospitality that the Bronze Age world took with the utmost seriousness. Hospitality was not merely kindness in this world, it was obligation, sacred in the way that things are sacred when they have been understood for long enough to feel inevitable. A traveler arriving in a stranger's door was to be fed and bathed and rested before any question of identity or purpose was asked, because the gods, in their ceaseless and occasionally troublesome wandering through the human world, a wandering we will come to understand more fully in the chapters ahead, were known to sometimes travel in disguise, and to turn away a stranger was to risk insulting something divine. This understanding ran beneath all exchange, all commerce, all the meeting of ships and harbors, giving even the most practical transaction a quality of the sacred, a quality of care. The sea itself, meanwhile, did not care about any of this. It moved in its own vast cycles, stirred by winds that came from mountain passes in lands no Bronze Age sailor had ever seen, carrying swells that had traveled for days before they broke, soft and exhausted, against some rocky promontory where a goat stood chewing without interest. The sea at evening turned colors that had no proper names, a deep rose, fading into something between purple and gray, a bronze-gold shimmer along the western horizon that Homer, centuries later, would reach for language to describe and would sometimes call in words that scholars still discuss with a kind of wondering affection, wine dark. Wine dark, that phrase so strange and so precise, the sea as deep and as old as something fermented, as something that warms from the inside, as something that asks you to sit with it a little longer before sleep. And so the sailors, their work done for the day, would have done exactly that, sat a little longer at the water's edge, or aboard their ships rocking gently at anchor, watching the light go out of the sky in its slow, unhurried way, the stars appearing one by one overhead like the lamps of a city very high and very far away, the water lapping at the hull, in a sound as close to a lullaby as the sea ever manages. Tomorrow the cargo would be unloaded, or the journey would continue, or a new harbor would appear around the next headland. But tonight the water held everything still, and the men who lived their lives on its surface could simply rest within its enormous, indifferent, utterly familiar embrace. And somewhere along that same great arc of coastline, in a palace city of limestone and shadow, a lineage of kings was passing its restless inheritance from father to son, shaping the man who would one day command the largest fleet this sea had ever carried. The lamps have been burning a long time in the great halls of Mycenae, generation after generation, each flame lit from the one before it, each king learning his throne from the hands of a father who had taken it by force, or by blood, or by the slow patience of outliving rivals. And by the time Agamemnon came into his power, the lamps had been burning so long that the smoke had darkened the painted plaster of the walls, had settled into the carved stonework above the doorways, had become part of the place itself, inseparable from what the house was and what it had always been. To understand Agamemnon, it helps to sit for a moment with the weight of the family he was born into, because no man who came from the House of Atreus ever stepped lightly through the world. And the story goes that this family carried something old and heavy in its blood, something that had been accumulating across the generations like water collecting in a low place, patient and still, and very deep. The Greeks themselves told stories about this lineage with a particular kind of gravity, the way you speak of weather that has been coming for a long time. And when they came to tell the story of Troy, they understood that Agamemnon had not simply decided one day to raise an army and sail east. He had arrived at that harbor called Aulis, already burdened, already shaped into the man he was, by everything that had happened before him. The house takes its name from Atreus, Agamemnon's father, though the trouble reached back even further than that, to a man named Tantalus, who is said to have been, in some tellings, a son of Zeus himself, raised to heights of favor that the ancient world found almost impossible to imagine. Invited to dine at the table of the gods on Olympus, given access to a closeness with the divine that no mortal had known. And it is said that he squandered this intimacy in a way so terrible that the Greeks used his name for centuries afterward as a kind of shorthand for suffering, which is where we get the word tantalized, the image of a man surrounded by things he cannot reach, water receding from his lips, fruit pulling back from his outstretched hand, a punishment designed to last forever in its particular cruelty. But that story is older and stranger than the one we are settling into tonight, and it lives in the background like a distant rumble, the kind of sound you are not sure you have heard until the silence comes back. Closer to us is Atreus himself and his brother Thyestes, and between these two men there ran a feud so layered and so dark that even the Greeks, who loved their violent histories, told it in hushed voices. The brothers quarreled over power and inheritance, over the kingship of Mycenae, and the story goes that their enmity grew into something that neither could step away from. The way a fire that has caught a great log will burn until nothing remains. The details of what passed between them belong to the older myths, to the long dark hours before our story begins. But the consequence matters. Atreus won, and he held Mycenae, and he raised two sons in the shadow of everything he had done to keep it. Those sons were Agamemnon and Menelaus, and they grew up inside walls that held the memory of what power had cost. Agamemnon was the elder, and from early life he seems to have been formed in the image of his inheritance, which is to say that he was serious and strong, and possessed of an ambition that was not quite simple ambition, but something more like a sense of obligation, the feeling that greatness was owed to him, and that he was therefore owed to greatness, that the long sacrifices of his family had purchased a destiny he was required to fulfill. This is a particular kind of heaviness to carry, the kind that makes a man seem larger than other men, and also somehow less free, because the man who believes himself chosen by his blood to rule is also in a sense imprisoned by that belief, unable to simply let a slight go unremarked, unable to show weakness without feeling that he is failing something much larger than himself. He married Clytemnestra, daughter of the king of Sparta, and she was a woman of considerable intelligence and will, the kind of woman who notices everything and forgets nothing. And together they settled into the great citadel at Mycenae, with its massive stone walls, the ones we still call Cyclopean today because the Greeks of later centuries could not believe that ordinary men had lifted such stones and supposed they must have been built by giants. The palace that rose within those walls was a place of painted floors and high ceilings, of hearth fires burning in the great central hall called the Megaron, of oil lamps placed in niches and on high stands, so that the light moved across the figures painted on the walls, the processions and the hunts, the animals and the offerings, giving them a kind of flickering life after dark, making the room feel inhabited by more than the people standing in it. From Mycenae, Agamemnon commanded the greatest concentration of power in the Greek world as it was then understood. He was, by the accounting of the Iliad, the king of kings, the man whom other powerful men acknowledged as first among them, and this position rested partly on his wealth, which was considerable, and partly on the strength of his army, which was formidable, and partly on the accumulated weight of his family's long dominance, the way a tree that has been growing in a field for many generations casts a shade that the younger trees simply learn to grow around. Other kings came to him, or came at his summons, and there is something in the way Homer describes his authority that suggests it was always a little uneasy, always requiring maintenance, the kind of leadership that depends on no one looking too closely at the exact nature of the agreement. And then came the trouble that would demand everything of him. His brother Menelaus, who had been given the Spartan throne partly through Agamemnon's own considerable influence, came to him with a grievance so personal and yet so political that it could not be separated into its two parts, could not be handled as a family matter and set aside, because the honor of a king was the honor of the kingdom, and the honor of the kingdom was the honor of all the kings who stood behind it. A guest had come to Sparta, a prince from across the Aegean, from the great and wealthy city of Troy, and this guest had departed in a manner that violated every law of hospitality the ancient world held sacred. And Agamemnon found himself standing at the edge of a decision that his entire inheritance had been preparing him to make, whether to let it pass or to gather the power of the Greek world and answer it. He could not let it pass, not because he was cruel or thoughtless or simply hungry for war, though the Iliad will show us he was capable of all these things in their moments, but because the man formed by the House of Atreus, raised inside those smoke-darkened walls, carrying that long accumulation of debt and duty and blood-purchased throne, was not a man who had been given the interior equipment to let it pass. To have done so would have required a kind of lightness he had never been taught, a freedom from the weight of his name that simply was not available to him. And so he began to send word to the other kings of Greece, to Nestor in sandy Pylos, to Odysseus in rocky Ithaca, to Diomedes, to Ajax, to all the men of power and reputation who owed him something or feared him enough. And slowly, across the weeks and months of that ancient world's slow communication, replies began to come back, and ships began to move, and a great and complicated machinery of alliance and obligation and personal ambition began to turn toward the beach at Aulis, that windswept place where a fleet might gather. But all of that assembling, all that noise and preparation and calculation, still lay ahead. For now, let the lamps in the great hall at Mycenae burn as they have always burned, steady in the windless interior air, throwing their warm and amber light across the painted walls, across the faces of the household gathered for the evening meal, across the map of a world that was about to change completely and did not yet know it. In the next softly passing stretch of this long story, we will cross the Aegean in our imagination, away from Mycenae and its heavy inheritance, and find ourselves instead in Sparta, where a young prince from Troy has arrived with gifts and a smile, and where the days of feasting and hospitality have just barely begun. The road to Sparta winds down through mountain passes where the air carries the cool, resinous scent of pine, where the stone underfoot is pale and dusty in the long afternoons, and where a traveler arriving from the sea might pause on a high ridge and look out over the valley of the Eurotas River spreading below like a broad green cloth laid between the hills. It is into this valley, and toward the palace that sat at its heart, that Paris of Troy came one day, a prince of a great eastern city, young and favored by beauty, sailing westward on what the story tells us was a diplomatic mission, a journey of goodwill between powerful houses, the kind of voyage that kings arranged with careful letters and trusted messengers sent months in advance. He had crossed the wine-dark water, he had arrived on a foreign shore, and now, descending toward Sparta, he would have seen the smoke of cook fires rising from the valley, and perhaps heard, faintly on the wind, the sound of dogs and the distant ring of bronze on stone. Menelaus was his host, king of Sparta, a broad-shouldered man who carried authority in the easy, unremarkable way of someone who has always had it, who has grown up among powerful men and become one without much ceremony. The ancient sources described him as a capable king rather than a brilliant one, generous in the way that kings were expected to be generous, warm enough in his hospitality, proud of his household and his position as brother to Agamemnon, the greatest warlord in the Greek world. His palace, the Megaron of Sparta, as scholars sometimes call it, would have been a place of considerable beauty by the standards of the age, its walls perhaps painted in warm ochre and deep blue, its central hearth burning through the long, cool evenings, the firelight reaching the carved wooden pillars and the hanging weapons and the painted faces of the ancestors looking down from wherever such things were kept. The smell of roasting meat would have settled into every beam and textile. The scent of pine resin and smoke was the permanent perfume of such a hall, and Paris, arriving from Troy, where the palaces were built in a different tradition, under different skies, would perhaps have noticed that everything here smelled of fire and oil and the particular earthiness of a house that had stood a long time and absorbed many seasons into its stones. The welcome given to a visiting prince in the Bronze Age world was not a simple affair of handshakes and brief courtesies. It was an elaborate and quite beautiful ritual that both parties understood to be serious, to carry weight, to create obligations that would last for years. The Greeks called it xenia, guest friendship, and it was as close to sacred law as anything that touched daily life. When a stranger of rank arrived at your threshold, you did not ask his name or his business until he had been fed and bathed and rested. You offered water for his hands and feet, oil for his skin, fresh clothing if his own was worn from travel, and then food, bread and meat and wine mixed with water in the great bronze bowls, and then more wine and conversation, and only when all of this had been attended to, might you lean across the table and say, gently with the fire warm between you, "Who are you, friend, and where do you come from?" The ritual was a way of saying, "Here, you are safe, you are a guest, and the gods are watching to make sure we both behave well." Paris would have been bathed and dressed in clean robes and seated near the hearth. The servants would have moved quietly with their wide, flat baskets of bread, and the wine would have been poured, and Menelaus himself would have sat across from his guest in the warm orange light of the evening, the fire burning low and steady in the central pit, its heat spreading outward toward the painted walls. We can imagine, though here we are imagining more than remembering, that the two men talked about the sea crossing, about the condition of various harbors, about weather patterns and the reliability of certain trade routes. They would have talked about horses, very likely, since both cultures admired them deeply, and perhaps about bronze working, about the relative qualities of Trojan and Spartan craftsmen, about the movements of other kings and the shifting loyalties of smaller city-states. Paris, it is said, was charming company, quick to smile, easy in conversation, beautiful in the way the ancient world associated with divine favor, since the gods were thought to bestow physical grace on those they loved. The days gathered slowly. Feasting was the structure around which everything else arranged itself. Long evenings in the hall, bards singing the old stories from their stools near the fire, the music of the lyre weaving through the smoky air, men drinking from painted cups and arguing amiably about the comparative courage of various heroes from the generation before theirs. Between the feasts there would have been the giving and receiving of gifts, which was perhaps the most carefully choreographed part of any royal visit, since gifts expressed both goodwill and status, and a man's generosity was one of the measures by which his character was understood. Menelaus would have brought out objects of beauty and craft, finely worked bronze vessels perhaps, or textiles dyed in colors that required enormous labor to produce, or jewelry of gold and silver wrought by skilled hands. Paris, for his part, would have presented gifts from Troy, from the great eastern city, whose craftsmen had their own long traditions, and whose access to eastern trade routes meant an abundance of materials and techniques that the Western Greek world could not easily replicate. There is something unhurried and almost tender in the picture of two men exchanging beautiful objects across a firelit table, each one turning the other's gift over in his hands, admiring its weight, its workmanship, the care that had gone into it. And Helen was there, Menelaus's wife, the most beautiful woman in the world, as every tradition insists on telling us, in that particular way ancient poets have of announcing things as settled facts, as if beauty of that magnitude were simply a given. A quality as measurable as height moved through these days with her own dignity and presence. We know very little about what she thought during this visit, what she noticed, what passed through her as she went about the ordered life of a queen, supervising the household, overseeing the stores, working at her loom, appearing in the hall in the evenings in her finest dress to sit beside her husband and greet their guests with the correct phrases of welcome. The ancient poets are not always generous with what went on inside her. The fire would have lit her face as it lit every other face in that hall, and Paris would have been across the table, beautiful and eastern and strange, and the evenings would have moved slowly as evenings do when something is quietly shifting beneath their surface, though no one yet knows what. It is said, and this is where the story becomes more legend than record, more dream than document, that Aphrodite had a hand in all of it, that the goddess who had promised Paris the most beautiful woman in the world was working her influence through those long Spartan evenings, making something that might not otherwise have caught fire begin to glow softly at its edges. Whether one takes this literally, as the ancient Greeks largely did, or understands it as a way of naming the frightening power of desire, its capacity to arrive without warning and rearrange everything, the result in the story is the same. Something changed in those days of feasting and gift-giving and firelit conversation, something small and quiet at first, perhaps no more than a long glance across the table, a hand resting for a moment too long, a feeling that the evening had become warmer than the fire alone could account for. And then Menelaus received word that he was needed in Crete, a matter of royal obligation, a funeral perhaps, some duty that could not be set aside. And he made arrangements for his household and for his guest, and he set sail, leaving Paris in the care of his palace and his servants and his queen. This departure is the hinge on which the entire age turns, though no one standing in that smoke-scented hall on the evening Menelaus packed for Crete would have understood it so. The fire in the hearth burned on as it always had, throwing its warm light across the painted walls, filling the air with the comfortable smell of pine and ash. The servants cleared the long tables. The night settled over the valley of the Eurotas, cool and deep, and Paris and Helen were still there in the palace together, and the lamps continued to burn, as they always do, long after the evening's guests have said their good nights and gone quietly to their rest. Let yourself grow still now, following the warmth of that ancient sire slowly down into darkness, into the ease of sleep, knowing that the story will be waiting for you, soft and patient and unhurried, whenever you are ready to return. The ships were ready before the stars had fully faded from the southern sky, their hulls dark against the gray water of the harbor, their sails furled and waiting like sleeping birds with folded wings. Paris had given his farewells to the court of Menelaus, or perhaps he had not given them at all, slipping away in the blue hour before dawn when the palace dogs still slept and the hearth fires had burned down to their quietest embers. This is the part of the story where certainty grows soft at the edges, where the ancient sources lean close and speak in lowered voices, because what happened in those final hours at Sparta is one of the oldest and most tenderly disputed questions in all of literature. And perhaps that is fitting, because what happened was not a single simple thing, but 1,000 small moments that added up to an irreversible departure. The story goes that Helen left willingly, and the story also goes that she was taken against her will. And perhaps both of these things contain some portion of truth, or perhaps the ancient world itself was not entirely sure how to name what had passed between a restless queen and a beautiful foreign prince who had spent long days in her husband's hall, eating at her husband's table, watching her from across the lamplight with eyes that the poets describe as being full of something that had no easy name. What is easier to say, and what all the stories agree upon, is simply this: she left. The harbor received the ships, and the ships received the sea, and by the time the morning light had spread its pale gold across the courtyards of the palace, there was an absence where a queen had been. Imagine those first moments of discovery, not as drama, not as rage splitting the air open, but as something slower and stranger, the quiet that falls before understanding arrives, a servant entering a chamber and finding it different than it should be, a door left open that should have been closed, the particular kind of stillness that a room holds when it has recently been emptied of someone it expected to keep. The harbor below the palace would have shown to anyone who looked only open water where the Trojan ships had been anchored, and the water would have been moving gently, as water always does, indifferent and unhurried, carrying nothing of the night's departure on its surface. Menelaus was not at Sparta when this happened, or so the story goes. He had sailed to Crete for a funeral, called away by duty and the obligations of guest friendship that bound the kings of that world to one another in elaborate webs of attendance and honor. The invitation had come, and he had gone, and the palace had continued in his absence, as palaces do, with its routines and its rhythms and its quiet life continuing in smaller rooms and outer courts, while the great hall stood in the particular dignified emptiness that great halls assume when kings are elsewhere, and Paris, the guest, had remained behind, which was not unusual in a world where hospitality required that a visitor be comfortable and well cared for, even in the host's absence. The household would have continued to set places for him, to offer wine and bread and the ordinary courtesies, and somewhere in those days something shifted. What Helen carried with her when she left is another question the poets have turned over for centuries, smoothing it like a stone in the hand. The story goes that she took treasure from the palace, gold and worked silver and fabrics, and the accumulated wealth that royal households kept in their inner storerooms. Some ancient sources suggest that Paris himself had brought gifts of such extraordinary value that the exchange felt, in some way, like a transaction that both parties had entered. Though even this framing smooths over the complexity of what it meant for a woman in the Bronze Age world to choose anything at all, to exert will in a world where her place and her movement were so tightly bound to the men who held authority over her. The poets understood this tension and did not always resolve it, and perhaps that is part of why the story has never grown simple, not in 3,000 years of telling. What the ships carried out of the harbor that morning, then, was not merely a woman and her gold. It was an old world's balance, shifting. The network of obligation and alliance and guest friendship that held the Aegean world together, like the knotted rope of a ship's rigging, that network had been cut at one of its important threads, and the whole arrangement was now in a slow process of recognizing the damage, even if no one quite yet knew what words to put to it. The journey from Sparta to Troy was not short. The sea route from the Peloponnese, north through the Aegean islands, through the narrow passage of the Hellespont, and into the waters near the coast of Asia Minor, this was a voyage of weeks, and the ancient sources disagreed gently about exactly how long Paris and Helen took to arrive. Some say they stopped at the island of Crane, just off the coast near Githian, and spent time there in the shelter of the harbor, while the wind settled and the crew rested, and something that may have been happiness, or may have been something more complicated, moved through those days. The story goes that Paris and Helen paused there together before continuing north, and the sea would have been around them in every direction, that particular shade of deep blue that the Aegean turns in the long afternoons, restless and gorgeous and indifferent all at once. On the shores of the Aegean, in Sparta and Mycenae and Pylos and all the great palace states of the Greek mainland, the news was spreading in the way that news spreads in a world without swift communication, by ship and by traveler, by the mouth of a merchant who had heard something at a harbor, by the messenger who arrived at the palace gate and was brought into the great hall to speak before assembled lords. And as the news spread, something else was spreading with it, something quieter and more deliberate, the first whispered conversations among men who had once sworn an oath. There had been an oath, the story goes, sworn by all the men who had once sought Helen's hand in marriage, back in the days before she became Menelaus's queen. A clever man, Odysseus of Ithaca, had proposed it, that all the suitors should swear to protect whoever among them was chosen, to stand behind the chosen husband if anyone should ever threaten his claim. It was a practical solution to what might have been a violent rivalry, and it had worked, in the sense that the marriage had proceeded peacefully. But oaths in the ancient world were not merely political conveniences. They were sacred things, woven into the fabric of a person's honor and their relationship to the gods. And now Menelaus was on Crete, hearing the news of what had happened in his own palace, and the oath was sitting there in the memory of every man who had spoken it, solid and immovable as stone. The conversations that followed would have been careful and slow, as consequential conversations tend to be. Brothers consulting brothers, kings sending runners to other kings, the great ship lords of the Aegean world beginning to turn their attention cautiously toward the east, where a Trojan prince was sailing home with a Spartan queen and a ship full of palace treasure. The coalition that would become the great expedition was not assembled overnight or in a moment of hot passion. It was assembled the way large things are assembled, gradually through obligation and persuasion and the patient work of men like Agamemnon, who understood that the machinery of alliance required tending and time. And Troy, on the far side of the Aegean, waited in its high-walled glory, not yet knowing what was coming, or perhaps knowing in some quiet, unspoken way that the ships arriving in its harbor carried more than they appeared to carry. The city would have received Paris and his companion with celebration, the story goes, or at least some of it did, while other voices within those walls spoke more carefully, more anxiously, aware that the man returning was not returning with gold and diplomatic success alone. The sea moved at the foot of those great walls as it always had, blue and restless and unchanged by human arrangements, lapping at the shore where soon so many ships would come to rest. For now, though, the world paused in that particular way it has before large things begin, not silent, not still, but breathing slowly the way a sleeper breathes in the deep hours of the night, unconscious of the morning gathering at the edge of the sky. The alliances were stirring, the oath-bound men were remembering their promises, and somewhere in the harbors of the Greek world, the first ships were beginning to be made ready. The great gathering was still ahead, still assembling itself king by king and harbor by harbor in the unhurried accumulation of a world preparing for something enormous. And that gathering, when we turn to it next, will have its own texture and its own slow ceremony spread out across a windswept shore. The sea held everything it knew, as it always does, in its moving and indifferent blue. The beach at Aulis is full of sound tonight. The low, continuous conversation of waves against hulls, the creak of rope and timber, the distant call of a gull riding the cold channel air above the strait. It is early morning still, or perhaps it is that liminal hour just before morning, when the darkness has not yet committed to leaving, and the stars are still faintly visible above the water, dimmed only slightly by the first gray suggestion of dawn along the eastern hills. The fires along the shore have burned down to orange coals, and the men sleeping nearest to them have pulled their cloaks tighter in the night, curling against the salt-edged chill that rolls in off the Euboean Sea. This is Aulis, a narrow harbor on the eastern coast of Boeotia, sheltered enough to hold ships, open enough to feel the full temperament of the wind that funnels through the strait between the mainland and the long green island of Euboea. It is not a grand place. It is not a palace or a city. It is a beach, a long curving shore of gray and brown sand, backed by low hills covered in scrub and stone. And it has been chosen not for its beauty, but for its geography. It is a gathering point, a place where the roads of Greece converge near the water, where a fleet can assemble without drifting too far into the open sea before its time. And what a fleet it is becoming. They have been arriving for weeks now, the ships sliding in from every direction across the Aegean, their dark hulls low in the water under the weight of men and provisions, their oars rising and dipping in slow rhythm, their square sails catching whatever breeze the gods see fit to offer. From the south come the ships of Sparta, deep-keeled and steady, bearing the soldiers of Menelaus, who stands at the prow of the lead vessel each morning and watches the water with the quiet intensity of a man carrying a very particular grief. From the west come vessels from Mycenae, painted at the bow with the symbols of the House of Atreus, the ships of Agamemnon, High King, commander of this assembled world, a man whose presence on the beach seems to reorganize the space around him, who walks among the arriving kings with his cloak trailing and his manner carefully composed between authority and welcome. From Ithaca come 12 ships under the command of Odysseus, who it is said arrived at Aulis with a creak of resigned practicality, as though he had calculated every possible outcome of this expedition, and had chosen to be here not out of blind loyalty, but out of some longer, quieter wisdom. From Phthia and Thessaly come the ships of the Myrmidons, sleek and fast, and at their head, a young man whose name the assembled Greeks speak with a certain reverence already, a kind of hushed admiration, Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, whose beauty and speed and ferocity on the battlefield are spoken of in tones that belong more to story than to ordinary conversation. He arrives without ceremony, and yet his arrival changes the feeling of the camp, as a fire changes the feeling of a room. From Pylos come the ships of old Nestor, who is full of years and counsel, and who seems genuinely pleased to see everyone, offering long reminiscences to any who will listen. From Salamis comes Ajax, enormous and untroubled, moving through the camp like a boulder that has learned to walk. From Crete comes Idomeneus, commanding a great contingent of bronze-armored men, and from Argos comes Diomedes young and fierce-eyed, whose reputation in war is already substantial. From a dozen other kingdoms and islands and coastal territories come their kings and chieftains and champions, each with their ships, each with their men, each carrying the particular weight of whatever promise or obligation brought them to this windswept shore. Homer, in the story as it has come down to us, describes this assembling of forces in a passage so long and detailed that it has come to be called the Catalogue of Ships, a great, rolling list of places and leaders and numbers of vessels, recited in the ancient tradition as both inventory and invocation, a way of naming the whole world that came to Aulis and asking that world to be remembered. The catalog names more than 1,000 ships in all, though scholars across the centuries have wondered and debated how literally such numbers ought to be taken, suggesting that the tradition may have grown in the telling across generations of singers, each adding a little grandeur to an already grand scene. But the feeling behind the catalog is genuine and worth sitting with, the sense of an entire civilization mobilizing, of a world in motion toward a single distant point. The days at Aulis have their own rhythm. In the mornings, the smoke from the cooking fires rises straight up through the still air, and the smell of barley porridge and dried fish and warm bread drifts through the camp in a domestic, grounding way, as though 10,000 men living on a beach are simply a very large household trying to organize its morning. Water is fetched from the springs in the hills behind the shore. Horses are watered and walked along the sand. The armorers move among their tools, the clang of metal on metal carrying clearly in the morning quiet. The priests make offerings at the shore's edge, pouring libations into the sea with murmured words, reading the flight of birds over the water, consulting the smoke of small fires for signs of the gods' intentions. And the wind, this is the trouble at Aulis, the thing that holds everything suspended. The winds are not right. Day after day the fleet waits, the sails hanging loose and useless, the men growing restless in the particular way that men grow restless when they are ready to do something and cannot yet begin. The strait through which they must sail is moody and capricious, and the fleet is too large to risk on uncertain weather, and so they wait, and the beach fills with the peculiar atmosphere of a vast enterprise holding its breath. In the evenings, the kings and chieftains gather in Agamemnon's tent or around the largest fire on the beach, and the talk is of strategy and supply, of alliances and obligations, of the city they are sailing toward, and what they expect to find there. Odysseus speaks carefully and is listened to with attention. Achilles says little and is watched when he does speak. Nestor tells long stories from older campaigns, and the younger men listen with a patience they may not entirely feel. Wine is passed. The oil lamps inside the tent cast their warm, wavering light across the faces of men who are trying to read the future in each other's expressions, as men always do when they are about to commit to something irrevocable. There is a tenderness to this moment, though it is difficult to name precisely. These men have come from their houses, from their harbors, from the beds where their wives still sleep, from the rooms where their children will wake in the morning without them. They have carried all of that with them to this gray beach, and it sits somewhere underneath the talk of war and honor and the long-promised justice of Menelaus's cause. Even the most battle-hardened among them, it is safe to imagine, has a moment in the evening when the camp quiets and the fire settles, when the distance between here and home becomes briefly, quietly immense. The sea at night in the harbor at Aulis is very dark. The ships rock gently at their moorings, hull against hull, in the crowded anchorage, the woods sighing and creaking in the slow rhythm of the water. The moon, when it rises over Euboea, lays a long, pale road across the strait, and a man standing at the water's edge and looking east might follow that road with his eyes all the way to the horizon, all the way to where the darkness becomes absolute in the far shore of the journey, Troy, the walled city, the place this whole enormous world is oriented toward, waits somewhere beyond the visible. But that is tomorrow's thought, or the thought of some other evening. Tonight, the beach at Aulis is simply itself, the fire slowly dimming, the sentries making their quiet rounds, the horses shifting and settling, the water moving in its ancient, indifferent way against the hulls of 1,000 ships. Let the sound of it carry you down now, that low and constant conversation of water against wood, the creak of a rope pulled taut, the breath of the sea moving through the camp. The men are resting. The fleet is gathered. Tomorrow will bring its own considerations, the question of the wind, the question of what the gods require, the long days of waiting that forge an army from a collection of proud and particular men. But all of that can wait, as the men of Aulis wait, patient and still in the darkness. Rest now. The water is keeping watch. The fires have been burning since before the sky began to lighten. Along the beach at Troy, where the hulls of 1,000 ships rest like sleeping creatures against the sand, the world of the warrior begins not with the crash of bronze or the cry of battle, but with something far quieter and far older, the slow, patient labor of men making themselves ready for another day. Smoke rises in thin gray columns from the cook fires, and the smell of it, wood smoke and barley and something animal turning on a spit, drifts out across the water and mingles with the salt air of the Aegean, that particular salt that seems almost sweet in the early morning, before the heat of the day has gathered itself and pressed down upon the plain. The men sleep close together, in the tents and lean-to shelters arranged in their long rows behind the ships. Soldiers lie in whatever arrangements comfort and habit have settled them into over the months and years of this long campaign. Some sleep deeply, turned away from the firelight, their breathing slow and even. Others lie half awake, in that suspended state between rest and waking, listening to the shore, to the water, to the sounds of their companions around them. The sea does not cease at night. It was there before they arrived on this distant coast, and it continues its patient conversation with the sand, pulling back and returning, indifferent to the great human endeavor taking place along its edge. When a man rises in the early darkness, he moves carefully, stepping around the bodies of his companions, finding his way by familiarity more than sight. He knows where his equipment is because he placed it the same way the night before, and the night before that, and all the nights stretching back to the beginning of the campaign. A warrior's relationship with his armor is not simply practical. It is intimate in a way that only daily use can make something intimate. The particular weight of the breastplate as it settles across the shoulders, the smell of the leather backing inside the bronze, the sound that the greaves make when they are fitted over the shins and tightened. Each piece has been handled so many times that the hands know it without the eyes needing to confirm anything. There is a kind of comfort in this, a small, steady certainty in a life that offers very little certainty otherwise. The helmet is the last thing, and it is something a man takes a moment with. The boar's tusk helmets that wealthy warriors wore, curved pieces of pale ivory fitted in rows and bound together with leather, curved to the shape of the head, would have taken extraordinary skill and patience to construct. The story goes, requiring the tusks of many boars hunted over many seasons, and the knowledge of their making passed between craftsmen in ways we can only imagine now. Even a simpler helmet, bronze hammered and fitted with a crest of horsehair that moves in the wind, carries a kind of weight beyond its physical mass. A man puts on a helmet and becomes something slightly different from the man who woke in the darkness. The transformation is not violent or sudden. It is quiet, incremental, the way the sky changes from black to deep blue to something approaching light, without any single moment you could point to and say, there, that is when the night ended. The morning meal is simple. Barley is the foundation of everything, ground and mixed with water and oil, or made into a rough bread on the flat stones beside the fire. There is cheese when there is cheese, and sometimes olives, and wine mixed carefully with water, because unmixed wine is for celebration or ceremony, not for a man who must keep his legs under him when the afternoon's work begins. Meat appears when there has been a sacrifice, when a priest or a great warrior has asked the gods for something and offered an animal in exchange. On those mornings the smell of roasting meat spreads through the entire camp, and even men far from the sacrifice lift their heads from whatever they are doing and breathe it in. It is the smell of divine attention in a way, evidence that the invisible world has been addressed and something has passed between men and gods. Prayer is woven through the day in a way that requires no special stillness or ceremony. A man stands at the edge of the water with a cup and pours a small portion of the wine out, watching it spread across the surface of the sea for a moment before disappearing, and says whatever he needs to say. He might ask for protection, he might ask for strength or skill or the simple mercy of returning to his tent that evening. He might ask for something on behalf of a companion or for news from home to be good when it finally comes. The gods in the understanding of these men are not distant. They are present in the way that weather is present, in the way that the sea is present, powerful, immediate, sometimes capricious, responding to what is offered with an attention that is real, even if it is not always predictable. A warrior who has been careless in his devotions feels this in the way another man might feel a debt unaddressed, a low, persistent unease that he carries through the day. The hours between the morning meal and the time when things begin to move toward the field are occupied in ways that might be surprising in their ordinariness. Equipment is repaired, sandals are relaced, spear shafts are examined for cracks, and if found wanting, set aside in favor of a replacement. A man with skill at one craft might spend time helping another, and these exchanges happen quietly, with the ease of men who have been living alongside each other long enough that they no longer need to explain everything. There is gambling with knuckle bones on flat pieces of ground near the ships, and there is conversation, and there is silence, long, comfortable silence between men who have already said most things and are content to simply be present in each other's company. The horses, where there are horses, require attention throughout the day. The great warriors who fight from chariots have grooms whose entire existence within the campaign is structured around the care of those animals, and it is careful, patient work, watering and feeding, checking the hooves, keeping the leather harness supple and repaired, and simply spending time near the animals in the way that horses need. The slow accumulation of trust and familiarity that makes an animal willing to carry a man toward the noise and confusion of battle without breaking away in terror. The sound of horses in a camp is unlike anything else. That low, intermittent presence of animals breathing and moving among all the human sounds, and it gives the camp a quality of aliveness, of something not entirely under human control. The afternoon on the days when there is fighting begins with a kind of gathering that is not quite orderly and not quite chaotic. Men move toward the plain, and the sounds of the camp shift from the domestic to something larger and less defined. The dust begins before the fighting does, rising from the movement of feet and hooves and chariot wheels on the dry ground of the Trojan plain, that fine pale dust that settles on everything, that works its way into the folds of clothing and the spaces between armor plates, that a man finds still on his skin when he finally sits by the fire that evening. It hangs in the air and softens the light and makes the distance look uncertain. Shapes moving through it that could be allies or enemies, until they are close enough to be resolved into individual men. And then the evening comes. The light changes over the water, going from the brightness of afternoon through something warm and golden to a softer, more complicated quality as the sun moves toward the horizon. Men who have survived the day's work come back to the camp in ones and small groups, and the fires are built up again, and the smell of smoke and food rises once more into the cooling air. A warrior settles by the fire with his companions, and the particular satisfaction of having endured another day passes through him without requiring any words. He reaches for the wine cup. Somewhere across the camp, someone is singing, not a battle song, not something large and formal, but something smaller and more personal. A melody that might have come from home, from a particular hillside or harbor that exists now only in memory. The fires burn down gradually through the night, the wood collapsing into itself, the flames growing quieter, the light pulling inward toward the coals, that deep and patient orange glow that asks nothing of the men around it except to rest. Tomorrow the plain will be there again. Tomorrow the dust will rise again over the same ground. But that is tomorrow, and tonight there is the fire, and the sound of the sea, and the slow loosening of a tired body settling toward sleep. And somewhere in the camp, in a shelter somewhat apart from the others, a great warrior sits awake a little longer than the rest, listening to the water, turning something over in his mind that has not yet resolved itself into quietness, and we will come to him, gently, in the time that follows. The sun has already passed its highest point over the plain, and the light falling across the Greek camp has taken on that particular quality of late afternoon, thick, amber-edged, heavy with the day's accumulated heat. And in this hour the cooking fires have not yet been lit, and the men sit in the narrow shadows of their ships and their tents, doing the small, patient work that fills the long hours between the great ones, sharpening bronze, mending leather, speaking in the low voices of men who are far from home and have been so for a very long time. The campaign has already stretched across many months, and the walls of Troy still stand as they have always stood, rising smooth and pale above the plain, and the Greeks have not yet broken them, and perhaps some of the men, on afternoons like this one, allow themselves to wonder if they ever will. It is into this mood, already fraying at the edges like old sailcloth, that the quarrel comes. The story as Homer tells it begins with a priest, an old man named Chryses who has come to the Greek camp to ransom his daughter, who was taken in a raid and given to Agamemnon as a prize. The old man comes humbly, with gold and with supplication, bearing the sacred staff of Apollo, and he asks only for his daughter back. And Agamemnon refuses him, harshly, and sends him away, and the old man walks back along the shore in his grief and his humiliation, and he prays to Apollo, the god of the silver bow, to make the Greeks pay for what has been done to him. Apollo hears. A plague falls upon the camp. For 9 days, the number 9 appearing as it often does in ancient stories, a span that means something more than counting, the span that means long enough to change things. For 9 days the sickness moves through the Greek host, and the funeral pyres burn along the beach, and the smoke rises in thin, pale columns into the sky. And the men grow frightened in the way that men in camps grow frightened, not with screaming but with silence, with the particular quietness of those who do not yet know what is happening to them or when it will stop. On the 10th day Achilles calls an assembly, and this small act, calling the men together, taking it upon himself to address the question that Agamemnon has not addressed, is itself already a kind of friction, a suggestion of where power truly lives in this army. A seer named Calchas speaks, and he is afraid to speak, as the story goes, because he knows what the truth is, and he knows it will not please the man who leads them, and he asks Achilles to protect him before he says what he knows, and Achilles agrees, and Calchas tells the assembled Greeks that the plague is Apollo's anger, and that the only way to end it is to return Chryseis, Agamemnon's prize, to her father without ransom. There is a silence. Agamemnon is angry in the way that powerful men are angry when they are told by the world that they must give something up. Not a hot, quick anger, but something colder and more calculating underneath it, something that looks for where it can recover what it has lost, and he agrees at last to give the girl back, but he demands that a replacement be found for him, that another prize be taken from another leader to compensate him, and his eyes, the story suggests, move to Achilles. Achilles answers him, and here the great anger begins. The exchange between them is long and bitter, as arguments between proud men always are, circling and returning, each statement slightly sharper than the last, and Achilles speaks the kind of truth that wounds because it is true. He says that it is the Greek soldiers who do the fighting, who take the prizes, and that what has already been divided cannot simply be taken back and redistributed at the pleasure of one man. And Agamemnon answers with authority, with rank, with the particular tone of a man who believes that his position entitles him to things that fairness might not. He says he will take Briseis, Achilles' own prize, his own captive woman, as compensation for surrendering Chryseis. He will take her to make the point that he is the greater king, that in this hierarchy, Achilles stands below him. Achilles comes very close to killing him. Homer describes this moment with a detail that speaks to how the ancient Greeks understood the relationship between impulse and choice. Achilles reaches for his sword, and then the goddess Athena appears to him, visible only to him, and she touches his bright hair and tells him to hold back, and he does. And this restraint, this choosing of words over bronze, is itself a kind of act of greatness, though it does not feel like one in the moment, not to Achilles, not to anyone watching. He speaks instead, and the words he speaks are terrible, and they are binding, and he swears by his staff, the staff of those who speak in assembly, carved from a tree that will never again bear leaves. He swears that the day will come when the Greeks will need him, when Hector or some other Trojan champion will be cutting men down in numbers that Agamemnon cannot turn back, and Agamemnon will regret what he has done this day, and there will be nothing he can do about that regret, because Achilles will not come. He will not fight. He withdraws. He goes to his ships, which stand at the edge of the camp, at the far end of the long line of Greek vessels drawn up on the beach, and the men of his contingent, the Myrmidons, follow him, and the space they leave in the camp is something the other men feel, without quite naming it, the way you feel the absence of warmth when a fire goes low. Briseis is taken from him by Agamemnon's heralds, who come reluctantly, the story goes, because they are embarrassed by their errand, and Achilles tells them they are not to blame, that the fault lies with the man who sent them, and he lets her go without resistance, and goes down to the water's edge and sits there, and weeps, and calls to his mother. His mother is Thetis, a sea nymph, and immortal, and she comes to him from the water the way the sea comes to the shore, quietly, without announcement, and she sits beside him, and she listens, and he tells her everything, and then he asks her for something. He asks her to go to Zeus, the father of gods and men, and ask him to give the Trojans the advantage in the fighting, so that the Greeks will suffer without him, and Agamemnon will see what it means to have dishonored the greatest of the warriors under his command. It is a strange request to ask for your own people to suffer in order to prove a point, and it does not make Achilles easy to love in this moment, and Homer does not ask us to find it easy, but it does make him entirely painfully human, and that is perhaps what Homer is asking us to understand. Thetis grieves for him. She tells him that she will go, that she will ask Zeus, and she disappears back into the silver water, and Achilles is left alone on the shore with the sound of it, the small continuous sound of the sea against the beach, which does not hurry and does not comfort and does not judge, but is simply there as it has always been. Meanwhile, the business of the army continues as it must. Chryseis is returned, the plague lifts, and there is sacrifice and song and a slow returning of ordinary life to the camp. But something has shifted beneath all of it. The men go about their routines, and they eat their meals, and they tell their stories, and they sleep in their tents, but the tents of the Myrmidons are quiet, and Achilles does not come to the assemblies, and the fires along that part of the shore burn lower than they used to, or perhaps they only seem to. The camp is a little less than it was, and the men feel it without saying so. In the days ahead, Troy itself will come into the story more fully. Its walls and its temples, its markets and its households, the ordinary people living their lives inside a city that has been under siege for longer than some of them can clearly remember. And it will help to go gently there, to see it not from the outside, as the Greeks see it, as a problem to be solved, a wall to be broken, but from within, as a place where people wake in the morning and make bread and watch their children grow in the long uncertain light of a world at war. But that is for another night's slow drifting. For now, there is only the shore, and the low sound of water moving against the hulls of ships, and somewhere along the beach a fire burning down to its quietest coals, and the night coming in softly from the sea. The smell of bread reaches you first, warm and faintly charred at the edges, carried on the morning air that moves through the narrow streets of Troy before the sun has fully climbed above the eastern ridge. It is a smell that belongs to every city, perhaps, in every age, but here it rises from clay ovens tucked into the corners of walled courtyards, tended by hands that have performed the same slow motions for decades, shaping and turning and setting aside, while the world outside the walls arranges itself into something that will one day be called legend. But inside those walls, for now, it is simply morning, and the bread is warm, and the city breathes. Troy, or Ilios as those who lived within her called her, that name carrying something softer and older in its sound, sat upon a gentle rise of land in the northwestern corner of what we now call Anatolia, where the wind that comes off the Aegean meets the slower, warmer air that rolls inland from the great plain below. The sight was not merely beautiful, though it was that. It was strategic in the way that only a city built by people who understood both the sea and the land can be, commanding the approach to the straits, positioned to watch the ships that moved between two worlds. And yet the city herself, from the inside, felt less like a fortress and more like a home, a layered, living, breathing home that had been built and rebuilt and added to across so many generations that no single person could fully hold all of her in their mind at once. The walls were real. Let us linger here because the walls were the thing that made Troy what she was. The archaeologists who have worked that site, a place called Hisarlik in the Turkish landscape, have found evidence of many cities built one upon the other across the centuries, layers pressed together like pages in a very old book, and it is said that the city most likely to correspond to the Troy of the poets was a substantial, well-fortified settlement, her outer walls built of cut stone and mud brick, rising to a considerable height, sloped and thick at the base in the manner of walls built to last rather than to impress. Guards would have walked along those walls in the early hours, looking out over the plain below, where in these particular years, the Greek ships were beached in their hundreds along the shore, their campfires still visible at night, like a scattering of dim stars brought down to earth. The guards would have looked and looked again, and then turned back toward the city, toward the warmth and noise of the life continuing behind them. Inside the citadel, the palace of Priam occupied the highest ground, as palaces do. The story goes that it was a place of many rooms, built around open courts, where light fell in long rectangles on stone floors, where servants moved with practiced quietness, where the smell of cedar and lamp oil and roasting meat mingled in the corridors. Priam was old. The poems describe him as a man of great years and great sorrows, and the palace around him carried that quality of a place where time has accumulated, where the furniture and the carved doorposts have absorbed so many seasons of use that they seem to hold their own memory. His queen, Hecuba, moved through these rooms with the particular gravity of a woman who has spent her whole life managing a large and complicated household, while also being expected to embody dignity in the face of whatever arrives at the gates. Some accounts say as many as 50 sons, though the story almost certainly softens and multiplies in the telling. But many children at least, real children with names and temperaments and favorite places to sit, and she knew the weight of each of them. The streets of the lower city wound below the citadel in the way that ancient streets tend to wind, not quite planned, not quite random, following the paths that people naturally wore into the ground when they moved between the places they needed to be. There were temples here, or sacred precincts at least, dedicated to the gods the Trojans honored, to Apollo most significantly, the archer god of light and music and plague, whose relationship with Troy was said to be one of particular care and protection. His sanctuary would have been a quiet place in the mornings, the air around it touched by the smell of incense and cold stone, the kind of place where a person pauses before entering, adjusting their sense of themselves in relation to something larger. Women came here with small offerings, grain, oil, a fold of cloth, things that cost something but not everything, the ordinary currency of devotion in a world where the divine was understood to be present and attentive and not always gentle. In the market spaces, which the archaeological imagination places near the gates where goods and people most naturally gathered, the textures of ordinary commerce continued, even in the years of the siege. Troy had always been a trading city, her position made her one, and even with the Greeks encamped on the shore below, supplies still moved through her, carried overland by allies and dependent communities in the Anatolian interior, arriving through the eastern gate on the backs of mules and in the arms of farmers from the surrounding plain, who still came, carefully on quieter days, to sell what they had grown. You might find dried figs laid out on cloth, and jars of oil sealed with wax, and fleeces rolled and waiting, and clay vessels of various sizes nested inside each other, and small worked pieces of bronze, clasps, pins, tiny figures of animals, made by craftsmen whose shops were set into the lower walls of the city, their doors open to the street, the sound of hammering drifting out in steady, patient rhythms. The families who lived in Troy's ordinary houses, the ones who were neither royal nor particularly powerful, lived in that way common to ancient urban life that is somehow both cramped and intimate, multiple generations sharing a walled compound, the older members of the household in the inner rooms, the younger ones spilling out into every available space, animals kept near enough for warmth and convenience, the smell of grain storage mixing with the smell of wool and wood smoke, and the particular warm smell of children sleeping in close quarters. These were people with names the poems rarely give us. Women weaving at their looms by the window that faces the interior courtyard. Old men sitting in the shade of a doorway, watching the street. Children chasing each other around a corner and disappearing into the wider city as children always do, heedless of everything above their immediate horizon. And yet even these ordinary people would have felt it, the thing that sat at the edge of every day, the awareness that the world outside the walls was not peaceful, that the plain below held an enormous force that had been there now for years, that the young men of the city went out through the gates and sometimes came back and sometimes did not. The women at the looms would have had husbands or brothers or sons among those who went out. The old men in the doorways would have watched the young men passing and understood something that the young men perhaps did not yet fully understand. The children, chasing each other through the streets, would have known the shape of the war, the way children know the shapes of things they cannot quite see, as a large and quiet presence in the adults around them, something that made the grown-ups pause sometimes in the middle of ordinary sentences and look away at nothing for a moment before returning. In the evenings, the light over Troy would have fallen from the west in a way that touched the stone walls golden, before fading into the deeper warmth of lamplight. Lamps lit in doorways, lamps carried from room to room, the oil burning slowly, the flame holding steady in the sheltered air of the courtyards, casting that familiar unsteady glow over faces gathered for the last meal of the day, for conversation that turned to quieter tones as the darkness deepened and the sounds of the city settled towards stillness. Beyond the walls, the plain was dark, and the Greek fires burned far away at the shore, small and distant, and the stars came out over everything, over the city and the camp and the sea, indifferent to the long human drama being played out beneath them. Troy at night was a city holding itself together, holding its breath only a little, trusting in its walls and its gods, and the warmth of the people inside it. And somewhere within those walls, Hector slept, that steady, careful man whose story we will come to soon, whose presence in the city was like the walls themselves, something the people leaned against without always thinking of it, something that made the word home feel as though it might hold. The lamplight rested on the stone floors, and the city breathed, and the night moved gently over everything. The fires have been burning low across the plain tonight, and somewhere between the murmur of the Greek camp and the distant lights of Troy's high walls, the air itself feels attended to, watched, breathed upon, touched by something that cannot quite be named or seen directly, only sensed at the corner of the eye, the way you might sense the presence of another person in a darkened room before you have heard them move. This is how the ancient Greeks lived their entire lives, not in fear exactly, though fear was certainly part of it, but in a state of permanent, intimate awareness that the world around them was not empty. The sky above the Aegean was not merely sky. The sea that rocked their ships was not merely water. The wind that lifted the dust on the plain before Troy and carried it sideways in long golden veils across the afternoon, that wind had a name and a mood and could be reasoned with or offended or gently entreated. The world the Greeks inhabited was full to the very edges, crowded with presences that moved among them and through them, and occasionally, when it pleased them, sat down at their fires and drank their wine. To understand the Iliad, to really hear it the way those early listeners heard it, lying back in the warm dark after the singer had finished, and letting the images float behind closed eyes, you must understand this first. The gods are not background decoration in the poem. They are not symbols or metaphors dressed in divine clothing. They are characters, and they are present, and they have opinions about almost everything. Picture Olympus as it existed in the Greek imagination, not precisely the mountain in the north of Greece, though that snow-capped peak did seem to pierce the heavens convincingly enough, but a higher, more abstract version of itself, a place above the clouds, where the air was so clear and golden that it seemed woven from light rather than atmosphere. The gods lived there in houses of gleaming stone, it is said, each deity in their own hall, and yet they gathered frequently in the great court of Zeus to argue, to feast, to take sides in the petty and enormous quarrels of the world below. Homer's Olympus is not serene. It is loud, it is political, it is full of domestic tension and ancient grievances, and the kind of simmering resentment that only immortality can sustain, because when you have forever, you can nurse a grudge with extraordinary patience. Zeus sits at the center of all of it, and yet his authority is far from absolute. His wife Hera watches him with bright, suspicious eyes, knowing the full catalog of his wanderings and deceptions, and she opposes him whenever she feels she has sufficient cause, which is often. Athena is clever and cool, always several moves ahead, always arranging the world, with the particular tidiness of a strategist who knows she is right. Apollo blazes with a kind of luminous intensity, and his anger, when it comes like sunlight concentrated through glass, precise, burning, merciless. Aphrodite is softer, but no less dangerous, her power the kind that moves in small, invisible gestures, and cannot be seen until long after the damage is done. And then there is Ares, who simply loves the work of war the way some men love the smell of rain, not because of what it means, but because of how it feels. What matters for those listening to the Iliad is that every one of these gods had a stake in what was happening on the plain before Troy, and every one of them acted on that stake directly, without hesitation, in ways that the humans below could sometimes half perceive and sometimes could not see at all. A Greek soldier on the battlefield understood something that feels strange to us now and might have felt entirely natural to him. That the moments of his greatest excellence were not entirely his own. When a warrior found himself moving faster than he thought possible, when his spear flew truer than his arm could account for, when courage came to him in a wave so sudden and so warm that it felt like hands placed on his shoulders from behind. This was not metaphor. This was the gods, leaning down through the veil between their world and his, lending him something of their own divine fire for the space of a breath or an hour. And when his strength failed, when his legs turned heavy and his vision clouded, and the enemy seemed to multiply before him, that too could be the gods, withdrawing their favor, or worse, turning their attention actively against him. This is why prayer was not an occasional practice for the Greeks, but a constant woven thread running through every part of daily life. Before the meal and after it, before the battle and during it. The smoke that rose from the altars, and there were altars everywhere, in the courtyards of palaces, in small shrines at the edge of camp, in the cups of wine poured onto the earth before drinking. All of that smoke carried intention upward, carrying human need into the golden air of Olympus, where it might be noticed, where it might land on the right divine ear at the right divine moment. In the Iliad, the gods descend bodily, or in forms that mimic the bodily, to speak to their favorites. Athena comes to Achilles in the very midst of his quarrel with Agamemnon, visible only to him, her gray eyes catching the firelight, her voice quiet and specific in his ear. Apollo walks the plain in disguise, wearing the face of a Trojan nobleman, steering events from within rather than above. Thetis, Achilles' mother, who is a sea goddess, rises from the waves at his weeping, and holds him the way any mother holds a son in grief, her arms around him, her voice low and aching. These are not visions. In the world of the poem, they are real, and yet there is something tender in the way Homer handles all of this. The gods are powerful beyond all human measure, and yet they are also, quietly, no wiser than the people they oversee. They argue about outcomes that affect millions, and make their decisions based on beauty and old grudges and personal affection. Hera wants Troy to fall, not because of any grand moral principle, but because of an insult to her vanity that has been burning in her chest for years. Aphrodite protects Paris not because he is worthy of protection, but because he once said she was the most beautiful, and she intends to collect on that compliment for as long as it takes. What this means, and perhaps what it meant to the Greeks who first told these stories and found comfort in them on long, restless nights, is that the universe is not indifferent. The gods are not absent. The world's randomness and cruelty and occasional inexplicable grace have faces and names and reasons, even if those reasons are not always fair, and even if fairness is not the thing they were built to provide. There is a strange comfort in that, felt even now across the enormous distance of time between us and those people who gathered around their fires in the Aegean dark. The wind moved because something moved it. The luck turned because something turned it. Nothing was without cause, and nothing was beyond the interest of powers that, however selfish, were at least paying attention. The fires on Olympus never truly go out in the poem, even in its quietest passages, in the slow hours between battles when the soldiers sleep and the watchfires burn down to embers. There is the sense of the gods still talking somewhere above, still leaning over the edges of their shining halls to watch the tiny lit figures on the plain below, still deciding, still interfering, still caring in their complicated, consuming, thoroughly divine way about what happens next. And so the mortal world of the Iliad is never quite mortal all the way through. It is a world where a man can look up from his evening fire and feel not unreasonably that someone is looking back, where the dust lifted by the wind might carry within it the breath of something older and larger than anything human language can comfortably hold, where the light on the water at dusk is not only beautiful but meant, sent somehow by powers that find in its beauty a reflection of their own. Let that thought rest gently with you now, the idea that the ancient sky above the Aegean was never empty, never silent, always attended by presences that burned like fire seen from a great distance, warm and distant and real. Tomorrow in the telling, the warriors will ride back out onto the plain, and the dust will rise again, and the great sweeping days of battle will begin to move. But that is for another evening. For now let the fires burn low, and let the gods keep their watch, and let the world of the poem hold you quietly at its edges as the night settles in around you. The plain breathes in the early morning before the armies have come down to it. There is a stillness to that wide, flat ground between the walls of Troy and the dark line of the Greek ships. A stillness that belongs entirely to the hour before men arrive to fill it with noise and motion and the terrible bright clash of bronze. The grass is still wet at its roots. A few birds move across the pale sky without hurrying. The river Scamander runs its course along the plain's western edge, catching what remains of the night's darkness in its current, carrying it slowly southward toward the sea. The dust that will rise later in the long afternoon heat has not yet been disturbed. It lies settled, patient, pale as ash, along the dry ground between the two encampments, waiting, as it always waits, for the day to begin. And then, gradually, the day does begin. From the Greek side come the sounds of men preparing, the low murmur of voices, the scrape and ring of bronze being lifted and fitted, the soft thud of sandals on packed earth, the smell of a morning fire already burning low after the first meal of the day. From Troy's high walls come the watchers, men and women both, pressing quietly to the ramparts to look out over the plain and count the ships, count the fires, measure with their eyes the distance between the city's stone gates and the long dark line of the enemy encampment. The watchers have done this every morning for a great many mornings now. They know what they are looking for. They know the silhouettes of certain men, the way a particular warrior moves when he walks toward the field, and they feel in their chests the slow tightening of recognition. This is how the great days of battle are born on the plain of Troy, not in a sudden eruption, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the long accumulated rhythm of morning preparation, the gradual descent from camp and city toward the open ground between, and the slow closing of the distance between two armies until there is almost no distance left at all. The plain itself is not a beautiful place, not precisely, though it has its moments. When the light comes at a certain low angle in the morning, it turns the dust to something almost golden, and the river glitters, and the walls of Troy above seem to float rather than stand. But as the sun rises and the heat begins to gather, the beauty recedes. The ground is uneven underfoot, broken by old dried watercourses and scattered stones, and the churned residue of previous days' fighting. It smells of dry earth, and as the day advances, of sweat and bronze and the particular sharp smell that seems to rise from the ground when many men stand upon it and begin to move in earnest. The battles that Homer gives us are not the disordered chaos that one might imagine. There is a shape to them, a structure that the Greeks understood and that the poem renders with extraordinary care and patience. The armies advance toward one another across the open ground, their shields overlapping, their spears raised, their voices lifting together in a sound that is something between a cry and a song, a sound that carries across the plain and reaches the walls of Troy and the watching figures upon them. The advance is slow at first. Men know what waits at its end. The slowness is not cowardice. It is the body's deep and reasonable reluctance to move toward harm, overcome step by loyalty and pride and the press of comrades on either side. And then the lines meet and the sound changes entirely. The great clashes on the plain before Troy are described in the poem with an intimacy that still astonishes after so many centuries of reading. An intimacy that gives each fallen man a name, a home, a father's name, a place of origin, sometimes a small vivid detail of the life he lived before he came to this dry and famous ground. A man from a city where the rivers run with fine cold water, a man who was the best horseman in his district, a man whose father is at this very moment waiting for a return that will not come. The poem does not let these men disappear into the abstraction of battle. It holds each one briefly in the light before letting him go, and the cumulative weight of all those small illuminated moments is part of what makes the battlefield of Troy feel so heavy, so old, so much larger than its geography. Among the great days of fighting there are duels, moments when the vast machinery of two armies pauses and two men step out from the lines to meet each other in the open space between. These encounters have a formality to them, a structure that both sides understand and observe. The warriors announce themselves to each other across the dusty air, speaking their names and the names of their fathers, claiming their lineage, asserting their right to stand in this place and be matched against a worthy opponent. There is pride in it, deep and serious pride, but there is also something that looks, from a certain angle, almost like courtesy, a recognition that the man across the open ground is a man, that his death will be lamented by someone, that the encounter between them is worthy of ceremony even here, even now. The great warriors of the Greek side move through these battle days with a quality the poem calls aristeia, a word that carries the sense of a man performing at the absolute height of his power, a day when everything in him rises to its fullest expression, and the battlefield seems to flow around him like water around a stone. Diomedes has such a day on the plain of Troy, and the poem renders it at length and with great care. He moves through the fighting like something that has briefly exceeded the ordinary boundaries of the human, wounding enemies and pressing forward with a kind of steady, terrible purposefulness that makes the men around him hold back and watch. It is said that on this day, Diomedes did something that no other mortal man managed in the long years of the war, that in the heat of his aristeia he wounded not one, but two of the immortal gods themselves, drawing bright divine blood, that is called in the poem ichor, the fluid that flows in the veins of the deathless ones in place of the dark blood of men. Whether the listener takes this as literal truth or as the poem's way of rendering an extraordinary human performance, the effect is the same. An image of a man burning at his utmost limit under the white afternoon sky of the plain. Ajax, the great Ajax from Salamis, fights differently. He is enormous in the poem, a wall of a man, steady and implacable where other heroes are quick and blazing. He does not have the particular fire of Achilles or the particular brilliance of Diomedes, but he has something the poem values enormously, a kind of absolute reliability, a refusal to yield ground, a willingness to be the last man standing between the army and disaster. When the Greeks are pressed back hard toward their ships, it is Ajax who stands at the center of the defensive line and holds. His shield, the poem tells us, is made of 7 layers of ox hide with a facing of bronze, and it is large enough that other men can shelter behind it. And when he plants himself on the plain of Troy, it is with the quality of something that has simply decided not to move, and finds, again and again, that it does not. The afternoons are the hardest hours. The dust rises thick and constant as the armies move back and forth across the churned plain, and the light comes down through it in a way that softens everything at the edges, turns the distant figures to shadows, makes it difficult to read the shape of the fighting from any distance. Men are thirsty. The water carriers move behind the lines with jars and skins, and the sound of drinking, brief and necessary, punctuates the noise of the battle. The bronze armor that seemed manageable in the cool morning is heavy now, heavy with the heat it has absorbed from the sun and with the long hours of wearing it, and the simple accumulation of exhaustion in the shoulders and the arms and the back. Even the great heroes feel this. The poem does not pretend otherwise. Greatness in the Iliad is not exemption from the body's weight. It is what a man does while carrying that weight still. When the light begins to fall and the heat breaks and the two armies draw apart across the cooling plain, the dust settles slowly back to the ground from which it came. The watchers on Troy's walls read what they can from the shapes of the retreating men, looking for the familiar ones, counting, assessing, their faces quiet with the particular kind of worry that has no immediate resolution, only the long wait for more information. And in the quiet of that settling evening, somewhere in the city behind those high walls, a man named Hector moves through the rooms of his house, with the weight of a whole city resting upon him, a man who carries something deeper than heroism, something the poem will take its time in showing, something gentle and specific and entirely human. That man and his story will find their own space, their own patience, their own slow and careful light, when the dust of the plain has fully settled and the night has come on. For now, the plain is quiet. The dust lies still along the ground again. The river Scamander moves as it always moves, carrying the day southward toward the sea. The dust has settled for a little while on the plain before the walls, and the afternoon light is beginning to soften toward that particular shade of amber that settles over the Aegean in the later hours, when the heat relents just enough to let a person breathe more slowly and think of something other than survival. The fires in the Greek camp are being coaxed back to life down by the shore, and up in the city the gates have drawn closed, and behind those great limestone walls the ordinary sounds of Troy are returning. Voices in the streets, the movement of animals, the low hum of a city that has learned, over long years of siege, how to go on living. And in the middle of all of this, moving between the world of war and the world of family with a kind of quiet, unhurried grace, there is Hector. He is perhaps the most fully human figure in the entire poem. Not because he lacks greatness, his courage is beyond question, his skill in battle acknowledged even by his enemies, but because the poem never lets us forget what he is fighting for and what it costs him. When we see Achilles, we see a man who burns, who exists in a state of almost divine intensity, who seems to belong as much to some other realm as to the common earth. When we see Hector, we see a man who belongs entirely to this world, to its loves and its ordinary beauties, to the smell of bread in the morning and the sound of his wife's voice and the weight of his infant son in his arms. He is rooted in Troy in a way that makes everything he does on the battlefield feel not like the pursuit of glory, but like an act of protection, an extension of the love he carries back behind those walls. He is the eldest son of Priam, king of Troy, and Hecuba his queen, and from the earliest age it is said he was marked out for leadership, not merely by his strength, though that was considerable, but by something in his bearing, a kind of serious attentiveness, a willingness to carry what needed to be carried without complaint. Troy was a city of 50 sons, according to the poem, and the royal house was vast and various, full of brothers of different temperaments and ambitions, but Hector stands at the center of it all as the one on whom the city depends, the one who understands that the walls mean nothing without the people willing to defend them. His relationship with his brother Paris is one of the more quietly complex threads in the entire story. Paris, who brought this war to Troy's doorstep, who stepped into the guest friendship of Menelaus and then departed with what was most precious to him, is not, in the poem's telling, much of a warrior. He is beautiful, charming, beloved by the goddess Aphrodite, and more at home in the perfumed rooms of the palace than on the hard ground of the battlefield. Hector does not conceal his frustration with this. There are moments in the poem where he speaks to Paris with a bluntness that is barely contained, urging him to take up his place in the fighting, to honor his obligations to the city, whose people are dying because of choices he made. And yet the frustration never curdles into contempt. He is still his brother. He still deserves to be met with something other than scorn. Hector holds both things at once, the anger and the love, with a steadiness that is one of his defining qualities. The most luminous moment in all of the Iliad, and perhaps in all of ancient literature, is the scene in which Hector comes back from the battlefield to seek out his wife Andromache and their infant son Astyanax. He finds her near the Scaean gate at the great wall of Troy, looking out toward the fighting, anxious in the way of someone who has spent too many days counting the hours between departures and returns. She comes to him with their child in her arms. And what follows is a conversation of extraordinary gentleness and sorrow. Andromache tells him that he is father and mother and brother to her now, that all her own family is gone, that he is everything she has left, and she begs him to pull back from the front lines, to command from the walls, to give her this one mercy. And Hector listens. He does not dismiss her. He does not tell her that glory requires him to be reckless, or that she should not worry herself with matters of war. He tells her instead that he understands her fear, that it matches his own, not fear for himself, but fear for what will become of her when Troy falls, as he believes, in the deep and honest part of himself, it eventually must. He does not believe the war will be won. He goes on fighting anyway, because someone must, because the city cannot be abandoned to despair, because the act of standing between harm and the people you love is its own kind of meaning, even when it cannot guarantee survival. And then when he reaches out to take his small son into his arms, the child recoils and cries, frightened by the great bronze helmet with its towering horsehair crest. And Hector laughs, a real laugh, quiet and warm and entirely human, and takes the helmet from his head and sets it on the ground, shining in the dust, and lifts the boy and holds him and speaks a prayer over him in the soft voice of a father who does not know how many more such moments he will have. He asks the gods to let his son grow up to be a man of worth, to be greater even than his father, so that people will say of him that he surpasses the one who came before. It is a prayer full of love and full of a kind of self-erasure, the hope not for his own glory, but for his child's flourishing in a world he is not sure he will live to see. Andromache laughs too, gently through her tears, and Hector sets the child back in her arms and touches her face and asks her not to grieve too much, because no one can send him to a fate that is not already his, and every person's thread is measured out before they ever draw their first breath. Whether this is true consolation, or simply the thing a person says when they have no other comfort to offer, the poem does not say. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps the line between those two things is thinner than we suppose. He moves through the city as a presence that people feel. When he walks the streets of Troy, the story suggests a kind of quiet authority that has nothing to do with rank and everything to do with character, the sense that here is a person who takes the weight of others onto himself, not because he is required to, but because he cannot imagine doing otherwise. He visits his mother Hecuba and speaks with her with tenderness. He exchanges words with the Trojan elders, who watch him with a mixture of gratitude and grief, knowing what his presence in the field costs him and what his absence would cost them. He is the city made flesh, its best qualities concentrated in a single human life, and he knows this. He does not carry it lightly. There is a scene in which Hector prays at an altar before returning to the battle, pouring a libation from a cup that catches the light in that particular way that bronze and terracotta catch afternoon light, a deep, warm reddish gleam, like something almost alive. He prays with genuine devotion, with the particular seriousness of a man who believes the gods are listening and who has nothing to hide from them. He asks not for invincibility, but for strength sufficient to the task, and for the protection of the city, and for the people who sleep within its walls to find rest. That image of the cup raised in the afternoon light, the libation poured, the prayer offered and released into the warm Aegean air, it stays with you. There is something in it that speaks to every person who has ever tried to protect something they love and known, in the quiet and honest parts of themselves, that protection is not the same as permanence. For now, Hector is still in Troy, still whole, still moving between the world of battle and the world of his family with that remarkable and heartbreaking grace. The walls still stand. The fires on the plain are burning low as the night comes on, and somewhere in the city the small sound of a child sleeping carries through a window into the dark. Tomorrow there will be more, and it will take all of Hector's strength to meet it. But tonight there is this: the warmth, the firelight, the breathing of the city at rest. The next story to find its way through the dark will take us beyond the walls again, out across the camp to a lamplit tent, where a delegation of grave and tired men is making its way to speak with the one warrior who is not yet fighting, to ask him, gently and earnestly. The fires along the Greek shore burn lower than they used to. You might notice it if you had been here from the beginning, if you had stood on the beach at Aulis and watched the fleet set out, all those hundreds of vessels with their painted prows, and their bright sails and their crews calling to one another across the water. You would notice now, walking the length of the camp in the cooling dark, that something has gone quieter, something has pulled back from the edge of itself. The fires are fewer. The voices that drift between the tents are softer. The whole long sprawl of the Greek encampment, which once felt like a city made of wood and rope and human ambition, feels tonight a little more like a place where men are waiting for something they cannot name. They have been losing, not catastrophically, not finally, but steadily, in the way that a tide removes sand, grain by grain, day by day, until you look down and discover that the ground beneath your feet has become uncertain. Hector has been driving them back. The Trojan forces, emboldened by the absence of Achilles, have pushed the Greeks toward the ships, and there have been days when the smell of smoke has carried the wrong kind of dread, the dread of men who can see what they stand to lose. The great ditch and rampart that the Greeks dug around their encampment, that long earthwork that once felt like an expression of confidence, feels tonight more like a confession of fear. And so Agamemnon has made a decision, a difficult one if you know the kind of man he is. A man for whom pride is not a weakness, but a load-bearing wall in the architecture of his identity. He has decided to offer Achilles something in return for his return. Not a simple request, an embassy, gifts enumerated carefully and at length. Riches, horses, cities, the hand of his own daughter in marriage. It is said that the list was long, and that Agamemnon had it spoken aloud twice, so that every man present understood the weight of what was being offered. And now, in the deepening dark, 3 men make their way along the beach toward the far end of the camp, where Achilles and his myrmidons have kept their separate and silent distance for so many weeks. The 3 men are Odysseus, and Ajax, and the old man Phoenix, a figure who goes back further than almost anyone in this story, who was once a kind of guardian to Achilles when he was young, who knew him as a boy before he became whatever it is he has become. They walk with a herald ahead of them, and between their feet the sand still holds the warmth of the day, a warmth that radiates upward through the soles of their sandals, even as the night air off the water moves cool against their arms and faces. The torches they carry toss long shadows sideways across the ground. The sea is there beside them, as it has been throughout everything, its sound low and continuous, the waves spending themselves gently on the shore in long white lines that appear and dissolve and appear again without urgency or end. When they reach the tent of Achilles, they find it lit from within. That is the detail that seems to matter somehow, that the tent is lit, that Achilles is awake, that the fire inside has not been banked or covered but is burning openly, warmly, and that when the embassy enters, they find him not brooding or restless, but sitting with a lyre in his hands, singing to himself, or to Patroclus, who sits nearby, listening in that particular quality of attention that old friends give to one another, comfortable and unhurried. The lyre is said to have been a beautiful thing. The story goes that its frame was made of silver-mounted tortoiseshell, and Achilles is said to have been genuinely gifted with it. Not performing, not consoling himself with noise, but actually engaged with the music, the way a man is engaged when he has found something that asks something real of him. He stops when they come in. He looks at them. And then, with a grace that perhaps surprises the embassy, he rises and welcomes them, calls for food, calls for wine, sits them down and sees to their comfort before any word of the matter at hand is spoken. There is something in this that is worth resting with for a moment. The image of Achilles the fearsome, Achilles the withdrawn and burning, playing host with genuine warmth to the men who have come to ask something of him. He is not cold. He is not a monument to his own grievance. He is a man, and he receives guests the way a man of his world was caught to receive them, with wine poured and meat offered, and no haste pushed upon the conversation. It is Odysseus who speaks first, when the meal is done, and the cups have been filled again, and the fire has settled into a steady breath of amber light. Odysseus, who is careful with words the way other men are careful with bronze. He knows how it bends, how it holds, where it might fail. He lays out the situation without exaggeration. The Greeks are suffering. Hector is formidable, and the Trojans are pressing the advantage of every day Achilles does not fight. And then he enumerates the gifts, the 7 tripods, the 10 talents of gold, the 20 bright cauldrons, the horses, the women, the cities, and Agamemnon's daughter, and the promise of honor returned, of acknowledgement, of precedence given back to Achilles in the company of kings. Achilles listens. He listens the way you listen when you are not going to say yes, but you are also not going to be dismissive. When the thing being said touches something real in you, even though it cannot move you where you are standing. And when Odysseus finishes, Achilles speaks, and what he says is remarkable for its honesty. He says that gifts mean nothing if the man who gives them can take them back whenever he chooses. He says that he came to Troy as part of a compact, and the compact was broken not by him but by Agamemnon, and that a man who allows that kind of treatment to pass unremarked becomes a man who can be treated that way again. He says, and this is the part the poem seems to hold with particular care, that he has been told of a choice, a fork in the road that was laid before him perhaps before he ever left home, a long life of quiet or a short life of glory. And he says, sitting in his warm tent with the fire beside him and the dark sea beyond, that he is no longer certain which of those he wants, or not much. There is something more like weariness, the weariness of a man who has carried a bright and burning thing for so long that he has almost forgotten what it felt like not to carry it, and who is beginning, in the long, slow watches of his days of withdrawal, to ask himself what it was all for. Ajax speaks after, and his speech is different, shorter, less ornamented, more direct. He says simply, "Your friends are here, and they need you, and the dead deserve honoring, and you are letting your rage outweigh your love." It is said that this almost moves Achilles more than the other arguments, because Ajax is not a political man, not a man of calculation, and the uncomplicated plainness of his words carries its own kind of weight. But Achilles does not say yes, not tonight. He tells them to sleep in the camp, and that he will think, and that he himself plans to sail home with the dawn. He does not sail with the dawn. The story knows this, and perhaps somewhere in the room there is a part of Achilles that knows it too. But that is what he says, and the embassy rises, and the night receives them again, and they walk back along the beach, in the company of the torchlight and the sound of the sea, which continues as it always continues, indifferent to the outcome of this or any conversation, spending its long white lines against the shore and pulling them back and spending them again in the dark. Phoenix stays. Phoenix, the old man, the one who knew him young, he stays behind in Achilles' tent, and they sit together in the firelight, and whatever passes between them in those hours is private and quiet, and the story does not follow them into it. The fire burns, the sea breathes, and somewhere in the Greek camp men are sleeping and dreaming of home, and somewhere in his tent a young man who was born for a short bright life sits awake a little longer, with his lyre resting against his knee, the strings still warm from his earlier playing, the night moving gently around the edges of the light. Tomorrow Patroclus will still be there when Achilles wakes, and for a little while yet that will feel like enough. The sun had been climbing for hours by the time the fires along the Trojan lines burned close enough that their smoke drifted all the way to the water, and on the shore the Greek ships began to catch the smell of it, that slow, acrid breath of things burning that did not belong to hearth or cook fire, but to something older and more desperate. The wind off the sea carried it inland and then back again, as though uncertain where to lay it down, and the men who stood at the water's edge and watched the distant smoke rising in slow columns against the pale morning sky knew what it meant. The Trojans had broken through. They had come far enough, close enough, that the outermost ships were in real danger now, their painted hulls and oiled timbers suddenly not symbols of homecoming, but objects of fuel. Inside his great tent, which stood at the far end of the encampment nearest the sea, Achilles had heard the sounds all morning without moving toward them. He had not withdrawn from the world in peace, that much had always been clear, but in a kind of furious stillness, the way a fire burns in a closed room, consuming the air around it slowly and without visible flame. He ate, he slept, he played the lyre, it is said, in those long, unhurried hours when the battle moaned and shifted at the edge of hearing, and Patroclus sat near him, or nearby, caught between two loyalties that pulled in different directions with every passing day. Patroclus had always been the quieter of the two, not lesser. Those who knew him understood that, but quieter in the way that still water is not shallow water. He had come to Achilles' household as a child, the story goes, after an accident in his youth that had required him to leave his own father's house, and in Achilles he had found something like a brother and something like a home, and the two of them had grown into manhood together under the same roof and then under the same long campaign sky. He knew Achilles as few people know anyone, not just the courage and the beauty and the terrible speed of him, but the tenderness underneath it, the parts that loved music and loved his friends and felt every slight as though it were carved directly into the skin. And so when Patroclus came to Achilles that morning with tears on his face, it was not a stranger's grief that crossed the threshold of the tent. It was the grief of someone who knew exactly how to reach the man inside. He spoke of the wounded. He spoke of Agamemnon and Diomedes and Odysseus lying in their tents with arrows still worked partway out of their flesh, their voices quieter than they had been. He spoke of Nestor, old and steady. He had counseled patience and cleverness for so many years, and now looked out from his white eyebrows at a situation that had moved past the reach of either. He spoke of the ships, the outermost ones, closest to the Trojan advance, beginning to take fire at their sterns, the smell of which they could both already smell without speaking of it. He did not ask Achilles to go back to Agamemnon. He did not ask Achilles to forgive or to yield or to do anything that might require him to swallow his pride whole. He asked only for the armor. "Let me wear it," he said. "Let me go out in your armor, with your Myrmidons behind me, and let the Trojans see what they think they see, and let their advance falter, while there is still time to falter it. Let them think for one afternoon that Achilles has returned." And Achilles, who had been sitting in the long amber light that came through the gaps in the tent walls, looked at his companion for what must have felt like a long time. The sounds of the distant battle shifted and settled like embers. Somewhere outside, the sea moved against the shore in the same unhurried rhythm it had kept through every day of this war, through every argument and prayer and funeral that had occurred within earshot of it. The water did not pause for human decisions. It simply kept coming and going, as it always had. He said yes. The arming of Patroclus is one of those moments that sits in the memory of the poem like a stone in still water, sending its rings outward in every direction. The armor of Achilles was not ordinary armor. It was not the kind of bronze and leather that a man acquired from a craftsman's workshop or inherited from a middling father. It was said to have come from the gods themselves, a gift for the wedding of Achilles' parents, worked with images and inlaid with a beauty that made it recognizable at a great distance. Greaves with silver clasps, a breastplate bright as fire in the morning, a great crested helmet with horsehair that moved in the wind like a living thing. A shield enormous and intricate, a world described in metal, cities and fields and dancing figures, and the deep-running ocean worked around its rim in enduring bronze. Patroclus put it on piece by piece. The men around him, the Myrmidons, Achilles' own people, who had been still and unused and restless all these long weeks of the withdrawal, began to move with new purpose, the way men do when something is broken open and there is finally something to do with all that accumulated readiness. They checked their spears and straightened their greaves and looked at one another with the particular expression of men who have been waiting a long time and are now waiting only a short time more. Achilles watched. He gave instructions. Careful ones, the story goes, more careful than one might expect from a man who had spent weeks burning with anger. He said, "Drive the Trojans back from the ships. Push them far enough that the camp is safe, the ships are safe, the fire is out, and then come back. Do not chase them all the way to the city walls. Do not press forward into what you cannot see. Come back when the immediate danger is over, and let that be enough for today." It is the kind of instruction that sounds careful in the telling and feels impossible in the living of it, because the momentum of battle, once entered, has its own voice, and that voice does not always speak of prudence. The Myrmidons moved out in formation, 5 ranks of them, steady and well-ordered as men who had spent their enforced rest not growing idle, but growing sharp. And ahead of them, unmistakable in that blazing armor, Patroclus led them forward into the afternoon. What happened next moved quickly, as things on a battlefield move when a single figure changes the emotional weather of thousands of men at once, who had been advancing with the kind of confidence that comes from having advanced successfully all morning, looked up and saw what they believed they saw. The crest on the helmet, the light off the shield, the particular way the armor carried itself at the head of a Myrmidon column, and something shifted in them, not panic, not yet, but that subtler thing that happens when certainty wobbles slightly in the chest. The fires at the ships began to be put out. The Trojans began to pull back, not in rout, but in reconsideration, the way a tide pulls back before you fully notice it has turned. The Greeks, who had been crouching behind their defenses and watching the morning go badly, began to straighten again, to reach for their spears again, to feel the afternoon become something navigable. Patroclus pushed forward. The armor was doing its work. The men behind him were doing their work, and the field was opening in ways that a warrior, in the body of the moment, reads his invitation. The Trojans fell back further. The distance between the Greek camp and the leading edge of battle stretched back out toward where it ought to be, toward the plain, toward the walls that could be seen distantly shimmering in the heat of the afternoon. For a long stretch of that afternoon, the day belonged to the armor of Achilles and to the man inside it. And from the tent at the edge of the sea, Achilles would have been able to hear the sounds change. Not the sounds of disaster any longer, but something different, something turning. The smoke from the ships began to thin. The sea behind the camp kept its old, patient sound, wave after wave arriving and withdrawing in the long and different rhythm that had underwritten every hour of this war. And for a little while, everything that Patroclus had asked for had been given, and the camp breathed again, and the afternoon light lay warm and golden across the plain of Troy, and the armor moved through it like a bright and borrowed fire. The dust had not yet settled from the afternoon's fighting when the light began to change, and if you had been standing on the high walls of Troy in that golden, heavy hour, you might have seen the whole plain laid out beneath you like something half-remembered from a dream. The long grass trampled flat, the dark smear of burned things along the shore, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a figure in armor that flashed like water catching the sun, moving through the chaos with a kind of terrible momentum, as though the battlefield itself had decided to organize itself around him. That figure was Patroclus. He had been given the armor of Achilles, the great gleaming bronze, the horsehair-crested helmet, the greaves that fit so perfectly along the shin, and when he had walked out of the tent and into the morning, the Myrmidons had looked at him with something between reverence and relief, because he looked from a distance exactly like the man they had been aching to follow again. It is said that the Greeks in the camp felt a kind of electricity move through them, the way the air thickens just before a summer storm, and even those who knew it was Patroclus felt their hearts lift at the sight of those bright shoulders, at the familiar crest bending in the sea wind, and Patroclus himself, quiet, gentle Patroclus, who had always been the one to sit with the wounded men and bring them watered wine, who had always been the one to soften Achilles' hard refusals with a word of kindness. Patroclus had felt something happen to him when he put on that armor. Something had entered him through the bronze, some fever of the day, some dangerous brightness, and he had led the Myrmidons out into the open with his spear raised and his voice clear, and the Trojans who had been pressing the Greeks hard toward their very ships had faltered when they saw that shape they feared most come striding out to meet them. He pushed them back. He pushed them all the way back from the ships, from the shore, from the dark edge of disaster, and the Greek camp behind him breathed again, and still he pushed. And here is where the story asks you to notice something, asks you to feel the slow, heavy turning of a thing that was always going to turn, because Achilles had said to him, had told him clearly, in that deep and serious voice he kept for the things that mattered, that Patroclus should drive the Trojans from the ships and then return. He should not pursue. He should not push too far into the open plain. He should not carry the fighting up toward the walls of Troy, where the gods and the great Trojan warriors waited, where the air was different, and the afternoon was old and full of danger. But the day had gotten into him. The armor had gotten into him. The success of those early hours, the sound of the Greeks cheering behind him, the sight of Trojans giving ground, all of it had carried Patroclus forward the way a wave carries driftwood, gently at first, and then without any possibility of stopping. He had crossed whatever invisible line he had been told not to cross, and the afternoon had deepened around him, and the dust was thick and golden everywhere, and somewhere beyond it the walls of Troy rose pale and ancient against the sky. The gods were watching. The gods were always watching, and in the way that Homer's world understands these things, it was Apollo, sun-bright Apollo, the archer, the protector of Troy, who moved against Patroclus first. It is said that Apollo came through the dust like a breath of something cold, invisible but present, and struck the helmet from Patroclus's head, so that it fell rolling in the dirt, that great horsehair crest trailing behind it in the dust, and the spear shattered in his hand. And the shield fell from his arm, and Patroclus stood suddenly exposed in the grinding heat of the late afternoon. The borrowed armor not fully his, the day turning against him in ways he could not quite see or name. Euphorbus struck him then, a Trojan warrior, a spear cast from behind, and the blow staggered him, but Patroclus was still standing, still trying to turn and make his way back toward the Greek lines, back toward safety, back toward Achilles and the tent and the sound of the sea. He was walking backward through the dust. He was badly hurt. And then Hector was there. Hector had been watching. Hector had seen Patroclus falter, had seen the helmet roll, had seen the day begin to turn in that direction, and he came forward with his spear, and he struck the killing blow, and Patroclus fell in the dust of the plain before Troy. and the afternoon went very quiet around him in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet, felt like the moment after a bronze bell is struck, when the sound is still spreading outward through the air, still moving, still reaching every corner of the world. There were words between them in the way that Homer tells it, because even in the worst moments, the heroes of this story find words for what is happening, find the breath to say the true thing before the dark comes fully down. Patroclus, dying in the dust, spoke clearly to Hector, and he said that death had not come to him through Hector's strength alone, that fate and Apollo had undone him first, and that Hector himself would not be long behind him. He said it without rage. He said it the way a man says something true that he cannot help but know, and then his breathing stopped, and the dust settled around him, and Hector stood over the body in the long slant of late afternoon light, and even Hector was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like acknowledgement. Then the fighting surged back in, because the body of a great warrior is a sacred and terrible prize, and both sides understood what the death of Patroclus meant, and what it would mean to bring his body back, or to lose it in the dirt. The Greeks came pressing forward to shield him, to carry him, to keep the Trojans from stripping the divine armor from his limbs, and the fighting over that body was long and exhausted, and full of grief, even as it was being fought, because everyone could feel the shape of what had just happened, could feel the enormous consequence of it, moving outward, like rings from a stone dropped in still water, moving toward the Greek camp, and the tent of Achilles, and everything that would come after. The body of Patroclus was carried from the field as the light finally failed, as the sun found the edge of the sea, and the sky above the plain turned that particular color of deep amber that comes just before true dark, when everything is gilded and strange, and a little difficult to look at directly. The Greek camp received him in near silence. Men who had been shouting all day found they had nothing to say. The fires were lit one by one along the shore, their reflections stretching out across the water in long pale lines, trembling in the breath of the evening wind, and the sound of the sea was what it always was, patient, enormous, entirely indifferent to the grief of men, and yet somehow, on that particular evening, even the sea seemed to be listening. Word moved through the camp the way word always moves through a camp, quietly at first, from man to man, sire to sire, spoken softly and then confirmed, and then simply known, settled into the air, like something that was now simply true and could not be made untrue. Patroclus was dead. He had gone too far. The armor of Achilles was taken, and somewhere in the camp, in a tent that had been deliberately and pointedly quiet for too many days, the news had not yet arrived. But it was coming. It was moving through the firelit evening toward the one man who would feel it most, who had loved Patroclus longest and most deeply, who had sent him out and who had set all of this in motion with a single act of proud withdrawal that he could not now undo. The fires along the shore breathed and flickered in the night wind, and the smoke went up and dissolved into the stars, and the camp settled into the uneasy sleep of men who know that tomorrow will be entirely different from today, who cannot yet imagine in what way, who only know that something enormous has shifted in the dark. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the fires burn low in your mind. Let the sound of the sea come in gently at the edges. Let the grief of that distant evening be something you only observe from a great and comfortable distance, resting here, warm and safe, and very far from any dusty plain. Tomorrow there is more to tell, a man waking to terrible news, and what a man like that does when the world he has held at arm's length comes crashing through the walls he built around himself. But that is for another night. For now, let the smoke rise and the stars hold still, and your breathing slow, and sleep come in like the tide. There is a particular quality to the air just before dawn on the Trojan plain, a coolness that comes not from the sea alone, but from something deeper, something that seems to rise out of the earth itself, as though the ground has been breathing quietly through the long dark hours, and now exhales one last slow breath before the sun reclaims the sky. The grasses along the riverbank of the Scamander bend in that breath. The water moves in its channel dark and patient, carrying the reflections of stars that are only just beginning to fade. The camp of the Greeks is still, or nearly still. The fires burn down to their orange hearts. The men lying in their cloaks, some sleeping, some staring upward at the softening dark. But at the edge of the shore, where the waves come in with their endless, unhurried rhythm, there is a figure who has not slept, who has not eaten, who has been sitting with his grief the way one sits beside a fire when the cold is very deep. Achilles has been given back something, though giving back is not quite the right word for what has happened. What he has been given back is himself, or a version of himself, the one who existed before the long paralysis of his withdrawal, before the tent and the silence and the lyre. That self has returned now, but it has been changed by grief the way metal is changed by fire, not destroyed, but made into something harder and more final. The armor arrived in the night. It is worth sitting quietly with that for a moment, because the Greeks understood the arrival of divine things, not as a sudden flash of the miraculous, but as something more intimate, more like the way a dream arrives, fully formed, already present, already inevitable. Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, it is said, worked through the night at his great bellows and his bronze and his hammers, and what he made was not merely armor, but a kind of argument, a statement about the nature of the world rendered in metal and light. The shield alone was said to contain the whole of existence as the Greeks understood it. Oceans and cities, harvests and weddings, courts of law and stars wheeling overhead, a world in miniature pressed into the curved surface of divine bronze. When Thetis, his mother, brought it to him across the sea, carried in her silver hands from Olympus to the shore, Achilles looked upon it, and the grief did not leave him, but it moved, shifted, became something else, became a kind of terrible resolve. He called the Greeks together that morning. You can imagine how the camp stirred when word passed from fire to fire, from man to man, each one touching the shoulder of the next, saying his name, the name of Achilles, saying that he had called an assembly, that he was coming out, that the long absence was ending. Men who had been sleeping sat upright. Men who had been preparing food set their bowls aside. The sound of it moved through the camp like water finding its level, a low ripple of voices that subsided into something very like reverence as the assembly gathered and waited. When Achilles rose to speak, the quarrel with Agamemnon was addressed and set aside, not warmly, not with the easy forgiveness of men who have forgotten, but with the particular exhaustion of a man who can no longer afford to carry two weights at once. His grief for Patroclus had become so vast that there was no room left in him for the old anger. It had not been healed. It had simply been eclipsed. He said, in the story as Homer tells it, that he was setting aside his anger now, that the Trojans would feel his return, and that whoever wished to fight should prepare themselves, for the day was coming and it would not wait. The preparation that followed was one of those mornings that seems to stretch and slow, the way important mornings often do, as though time itself is paying attention. Achilles put on the armor piece by piece. The greaves first, fitted to his calves, clasped with their silver fastenings. Then the breastplate, broad and gleaming, catching the early light and returning it changed. The sword, silver-studded, hung at his side. The great shield was lifted, and where it caught the sun, it was said to throw back a light so bright that men had to look away. A light like a signal fire seen from across water, like a star brought down and carried close. And then the helmet with its horsehair crest, which he set upon his head last of all, and when he moved, the crest trembled and caught the wind, and the man inside all that shining bronze became something more than a man, or at least appeared to, which in a Greek understanding of the world amounted almost to the same thing. He took the spear, the great ash spear from Pelion that his father Peleus had received as a gift from the centaur Chiron, the one weapon in all the army that no other man could even lift, and with that spear in his hand he was complete. The grief and the armor and the resolve all gathered into a single shape that stood on the edge of the plain and looked toward Troy. The horses were brought, Xanthus and Balius, the immortal horses given by the gods to Peleus and now inherited by his son. It is said, in the way that Homer says so many strange and luminous things, that as Achilles called to them, one of the horses turned its head and spoke, telling him that he would come home today, but that his day was also coming, that his death was not so far as it seemed in that bright morning. Achilles answered that he knew this, that he had always known it, but that he would not stop. And then the army moved. What happens to a battlefield when a force of extraordinary power re-enters it is something that military accounts across many ages have attempted to describe, and they all arrive, eventually, at the same difficulty, which is that the change is felt before it is seen. The Trojans on the plain felt it before they understood it. A shift in the quality of the air, a sound that was different, the particular silence that falls over a flock of birds in the moment before they take flight. And then they saw what was coming toward them, the armor that blazed like the sun, the figure moving at the center of the Greek advance, faster than the others, more certain. And something moved through the Trojan lines that was not quite fear and not quite awe, but held something of both. The plain before Troy had seen many difficult days in the long years of the war, days of advance and retreat, of the Greeks nearly broken, of the Trojans almost triumphant. It had seen the dust rise in great pale columns in the afternoon heat, had seen men fall and be carried away, had absorbed into its soil something of every battle fought upon it. But this day was different, and the men on both sides, those who would tell the story afterward, if there were men left to tell it, seemed to have understood that they were inside something significant, that the wheel of the war had turned to a new position. Achilles moves through the field the way a river moves when the snow melts and the season turns, with a momentum that does not pause or hesitate, that takes the shape of whatever is before it and pushes through. The Trojans fell back, and then fell back further, and the ground between the armies shifted and tilted, and Troy's walls, which had felt very close that morning, felt suddenly very far. There is something very old in this image, something the Greeks returned to again and again in their understanding of the world. The idea that a single human being, shaped by grief and loss and an almost unbearable love, could become for a time something that bent the world around them. Not a god, not immortal, not protected from what was coming, but for this one day, on this one plane, under this particular light, more fully themselves than most people ever managed to be. The river Scamander ran at the edge of the plain and caught in its current the late afternoon light, turning it to gold, carrying it slowly toward the sea. The army pressed forward. The walls of Troy stood against the sky, and somewhere within them the city waited and listened, and the people on the walls looked down at what was coming across the plain and held very still. It had been a long, bright, terrible day, and it was not yet finished. But the next part of it belongs to another telling, and for now the torches of the Greek camp burn low and amber on the shore, and the water moves in its dark channel, and there is time enough, and more than enough, to let the eyes close, and the breath slow, and the plain and its dust and its shining figure fade gently, gently, into the deep and restoring quiet of sleep. The dust has not yet settled from the long day's fighting, and the plain before Troy lies exhausted beneath a sky that has deepened from the pale gold of late afternoon into something richer, something bruised and luminous, the color of old bronze left out beneath an open heaven. The air still holds the warmth of the sun, radiating up from the baked earth in slow, invisible waves, and the grasses at the edges of the plain, those dry, silver-stemmed grasses that grow where the churned ground softens back into wilderness, stand perfectly still, as though even the wind has paused to watch what is about to happen. You have been traveling a long while through this story, and the world has grown familiar to you now. The smell of salt from the harbor, the low sound of voices inside tents at evening, the way bronze catches light and holds it for a moment before giving it back to the air. And tonight, all of that familiar world has gathered itself into this single hour, this single stretch of open ground, where two figures are moving toward one another across the dust. Achilles has been searching. Since the death of Patroclus, since the grief tore through him like something beyond grief, beyond any word that language has made, he has moved across this battlefield like a force that has forgotten it was ever a man. The new armor that Hephaestus forged for him, it is said to have gleamed so brilliantly when he first put it on that the Myrmidons around him could not look directly at the light, has grown familiar now with the day's work, its bronze surfaces marked with the particular dust and effort of a long afternoon of war. He has driven men before him the way a fire drives before it through dry fields in late summer, steady and without pause, and the plain has emptied around his path. And now there is only Hector. The other Trojans have retreated through the great gates. The story goes that as Achilles came on, moving across the open ground in a way that made the air itself seem to part before him, the Trojan soldiers who had been making their way back toward the walls hastened their steps, and the gates opened and the men poured through and the gates were drawn shut again because there was nothing else to do. What could walls keep out at this particular moment except the one man who had already decided to remain outside them. Hector stood alone before the Scaean gates. From the walls above, his family would have seen him standing there. His mother Hecuba, it is said, called down to him. His father Priam, who had watched the day from the walls with the slow, particular anguish of a man who has seen everything and can change nothing, called down to him too. Their voices would have come to him like something heard through water, real but softened, arriving from a world that was already beginning to feel like a world he was watching from a distance. The old king, who had known so many years, who had held this city and these people in this long, impossible siege in his keeping, pleaded with his son to come inside. It is said that Priam's words were those of a man who understood exactly what he was watching, who could see the whole shape of the moment as clearly as you might see a single lamp burning in a dark room from far away. Hector did not come inside. What moved through him in those moments before Achilles arrived, no one can say with certainty. But Homer gives us a glimpse of something that feels entirely true, a kind of paralysis, a considering of possibilities that melted one by one like morning frost, until only the single fact remained that he was the one who had led the Trojans out onto the plain that day, and Patroclus had died wearing Achilles' armor, and the armor of Achilles now belonged to Hector himself, and all of these things were wound together in a knot that no careful thinking could undo. He had brought this moment about in all the ways that matter, and now the moment had come. When Achilles appeared, something happened that the story describes without apology. Hector ran. It is important to sit with this for a moment, quietly, because it is not a cowardice. The body knows things that resolve does not. The body, which had fought so long and so bravely, which had held itself steady through years of this war, looked at what was coming across the plain and understood it with a kind of animal clarity that went beneath thought. And so Hector ran, and Achilles came after him, and the two of them moved around the walls of the great city in a circuit that has something dreamlike and terrible about it. Two men running beneath the eyes of everyone, the walls above lined with watchers, the gods watching from still higher, the dust rising beneath their feet in slow, soft plumes that the still air barely disturbed. 3 times around the walls, the story goes, past the fig tree, past the 2 springs, one warm, one cold, where the women of Troy had once brought their washing before the war made such gentle errands impossible, past all the ordinary landmarks of a city that had once been full of ordinary life, and perhaps in those long circling moments, something of all that earlier life was present, hanging in the air like the warmth still rising from the stones. It was a god, as the Greeks understood it, who brought the running to its end. Athena, it is said, came to Hector in the shape of his brother Deiphobus, appearing beside him and speaking in a voice that sounded like the voice of someone he loved and trusted. And in that shape, she encouraged him to turn and face Achilles, to stand and fight. And Hector turned. He turned because he was Hector, and turning was what Hector had always done. They spoke before they fought, as warriors in this world so often did. Hector asked for a promise that whichever of them died, the other would return his body to his own people. It was not an unreasonable thing to ask. It was the thing that anyone, any person who had ever loved something and feared losing it, would ask. Achilles refused. He refused absolutely, with a heat that was not cruelty so much as grief pressed past its limit, grief that had nowhere left to go but into this final irreversible thing. And then they closed the distance between them. Achilles threw his spear first, and missed, and Athena, it is said, returned the spear to his hand unseen. Hector threw his own spear, which struck the shield that Hephaestus had made, and the shield held as divine bronze holds, without yielding, without so much as denting, as though the spear had struck the face of the sky itself. Hector reached for another spear, and found nothing. He drew his sword and came forward. What happened next is told swiftly in the poem, the way true things sometimes are. Achilles watched for the gap in the armor that had been his own armor, the armor he knew as he knew his own body. And when the gap appeared at the base of the throat, he drove his spear through it. Hector fell slowly, as the poem imagines it. He fell and the dust received him, and even in falling he spoke. He asked Achilles again, with the last breath available to him, to let his body go home. He spoke of his father and mother, and of Andromache his wife. And Achilles, still burning with everything he carried, said what he said, and Hector's breath left him, and the plain was quiet for a moment, in the way that places become quiet after something large has moved through them. The walls of Troy would have been silent too, for that particular hell-breath moment, before everything that silence contained began to release itself into the evening air. The light on the plain has changed while you have been here. The bronze gold of the afternoon has given way to something cooler, a silver gray that softens all the shapes of the world and makes the dust settle slowly, softly back toward the earth. The walls of Troy are still standing in that fading light, still holding their height against the darkening sky. And inside those walls there are rooms and fires and the sounds of a city that does not yet fully know what it has lost. The fires inside Troy will burn tonight as they have burned every night of this long war, low and steady in the hearths, casting their warmth against the stones. And by one of those fires, in the deep quiet of the night, something is about to happen that has no war in it at all. An old man will make a journey through the dark, carrying grief and something very like hope. And at the end of that journey, two people who have every reason to be enemies will sit together and find for a little while something that feels almost like peace. Let that thought carry you gently now into your rest. The dust has settled on the plain. The stars are coming out above the wine-dark sea one by one, in the slow and patient way they always have. The night had settled fully over the plain of Troy by the time the old king made his decision. A night so deep and so still that even the fires burning along the Greek shoreline seemed to burn more quietly than usual, their orange light reflecting in long, wavering columns across the black surface of the seas, as though the flames themselves were tired and had consented at last to a kind of rest. Priam had sat for many hours in his great hall, surrounded by the sounds of his city's grief, and the grief was immense, filling every corridor and courtyard, lying across every threshold like something physical, something with weight and texture. His son Hector had been dead for days now, his body dragged and dishonored before the very walls behind which his family still breathed and moved and wept, and the old king had endured all of it in a state that moved somewhere between anguish and a strange, almost luminous calm, as though the very extremity of his suffering had carried him through to some quieter place on the far side of it. It is said that the god Hermes came to him that night, or that something moved in the darkness that felt like divine permission, a gentle loosening of the fear that had held him in his chair for so long, and whatever its source, Priam rose from where he sat and began to prepare. He gathered ransom, gold and bronze and finely woven cloth, objects of extraordinary beauty and worth, treasures that had accumulated across the long decades of his reign, and that now he would carry across the open dark ground between two armies to lay before the man who had killed his son. His wife Hecuba pleaded with him not to go. The story goes that she wept and held him and told him that Achilles was a man outside the ordinary laws of men, that grief had made him something feral and uncontained, and that the old king would be cut down before he ever opened his mouth to speak. But Priam was resolved in the way that only the very old and the very bereft can be resolved, with nothing left to lose that mattered more than this one thing, this single necessary act, and so he went. His wagon moved out through the gates of Troy in the darkness, laden with its precious cargo, driven slowly across the flat plain that had been a place of battle and noise and bronze-clashing violence for 9 long years, and that was now, in the deep hours of the night, utterly silent. The grass where it still grew between the ruts and scorched patches was wet with dew. The air carried the faint salt of the sea, and the residual warmth of the day just past, and somewhere behind him, the fires of his city burned low against the dark, their light softening as the distance grew. Hermes, or the figure that moved like Hermes, is said to have guided the wagon safely through the Greek sentries, past the watchfires and the drowsing guards, through the perimeter of the camp, and along the path that led toward the tent of Achilles. The great warrior was camped somewhat apart from the rest of the Greeks, as suited a man who had set himself apart from the whole enterprise of the war. And his tent was large, and the fires before it had burned down to embers, breathing gently, their light the color of old amber, steady and low. Priam entered and stood before Achilles, and what he did next was a thing so old and so fundamental that it predates any story ever told about it. He knelt. The king of Troy, the father of 50 sons, a man who had ruled a great and wealthy city for more decades than most men lived, knelt before the man who had killed his greatest child and most beloved defender. And he took Achilles by the hands, and he called him by a word that no enemy had ever called him. He called him by the word that means son. He said that he had done what no man before him had done, and he was right. He had kissed the hands of the man who killed his son. He asked only for the body of Hector, to wash it and wrap it and lay it in the earth as the dead deserve to be laid. And as he spoke, he did not speak as a king or as an enemy, but simply as a father, stripped of every other attribute, reduced to that one essential thing. Something happened in the tent then that the poem reaches for with extraordinary care. Achilles looked at the old man and thought of his own father Peleus, who was old and alone far away in Phthia, who would one day hear news of his son's death as Priam had heard news of Hector's. And the grief that Achilles had been carrying, that immense and volcanic grief that had reshaped the whole shape of the war, shifted somehow, found in Priam's grief a kind of mirror, and the two men wept together. They wept for different losses, and from different sides of a war that had consumed a decade of their lives, and yet the weeping was the same, rising from the same dark well that all human mourning draws from, wordless and without border. It is said that Achilles was moved in a way he had not been moved since Patroclus fell, and that the movement was not weakness, but something more like recognition, the recognition of shared mortality, of the fact that all men lose what they love, and all men die, that the walls of Troy and the ships of Greece and the whole bronze-clashing machinery of war were in the end just the temporary stage upon which this older and more essential drama played itself out. He agreed he would return the body of Hector. He told Priam this gently, and the gentleness was not a small thing from a man who had spent his fury so extravagantly in recent days. He had his companions wash and prepare Hector's body, attending to it carefully, and the story goes that he had them do this out of Priam's sight so that the old king would not see the wounds and be overcome again, because Achilles feared his own anger returning if Priam's fresh weeping stirred him. And this fear, this awareness of his own capacity for violence, is perhaps the most human thing in the whole long poem. They sat together then and ate. Achilles and Priam, enemies across every line that could divide two men, sat in the lamplight of the tent and ate bread and meat, and looked at one another, and the food was simple and the eating was slow, and the fire outside had settled to its quietest breath, an ember glow that rose and fell as the night air moved gently through the camp. Priam asked to sleep, for he was very old and had been awake through many terrible days, and Achilles agreed, and saw to it that the old king had blankets and a bed made for him in the entrance of the tent, a careful placement so that none of the other Greeks would see him and be stirred to some act of harm or disrespect. He promised Priam the time he needed for the funeral rites of Hector, the 11 days of mourning that a proper burial required, and Priam received this promise and closed his eyes in the tent of his son's killer with something that the story allows us to call, without too much presumption, peace. The night moved on above them both. The sea along the shore breathed its long, patient breath, drawing in and releasing, as it had done through all the long years of the war, and as it would do long after every man who had fought beneath these skies was gone. The embers outside the tent glowed their steady amber, neither growing nor diminishing, just present and warm in the surrounding dark, a small and faithful light in the middle of a very large night. There is something the poem understands that is easy to miss if you move through it too quickly. It understands that the truest moments between human beings happen not in the noise and bronze clash of the battlefield, but in these quiet intervals, these dark hours when the fire is low and the words have run out, and two people simply exist together in the recognition that they are both alive and will not always be. Priam and Achilles could not be more different. They have lost to each other. They are bound by grief to one of the most ancient and irreducible forms of understanding. And so the night held them both, the old king sleeping in the tent of the great warrior, the fires along the shore burning their slow and steady gold, and the whole long story of the Iliad drawing now towards something that feels less like an ending than a shoreline, a place where the wave of all these days comes at last to rest, gently, on the waiting sand. And if you let yourself drift now, into that same soft dark, the next night's telling will gather all these strands, all these faces and fires, and long journeys across the wine-dark sea, and let them settle slowly into stillness together. The tide comes in very slowly tonight, as it always has, washing over the same dark stones it has touched for 3,000 years and more, smoothing them, returning to the deep, and coming back again, patient and unhurried, as though the sea itself has nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove. And so we find ourselves here, at the edge of things, at the place where the story does not so much end as it gently releases its hold, the way a hand opens in sleep, the way a lamp dims not all at once, but by slow, warm degrees, until the darkness that surrounds it is soft rather than heavy, and the room feels held rather than empty. We have come a long way together through these quiet nights, you and I, and it seems right to linger here a little while, to let the images drift back through the water of memory, the way reflections ripple and resettle on a calm surface, not to relive anything with urgency or sharp feeling, but simply to let it all be present once more, gently, before we rest. There was a world once, beneath skies of extraordinary blue, where palaces rose on hilltops and harbors curved like cupped hands along a coast that smelled of salt and cedar and warm stone. The people who lived in that world woke each morning to the sound of the sea, to the cry of birds above the water, to the particular quality of light that falls across the Aegean in the early hours when everything is still gold and nothing has yet been decided. They traded and sailed and feasted and quarreled, as people have always done, and they looked up at the same moon that looks down on you now, and found in it the same mixture of comfort and mystery that you might find there yourself, if you were to look. The houses of great men stood at the center of that world, full of flickering torchlight and the smell of roasting meat, and the sound of cups set down on stone, and from those houses the threads of the story ran outward in all directions, tangled and long. There was a family burdened by ambition, by blood debts and old grievances that reached back generations, and from that family came a king who led a fleet so vast the mind can barely hold it, a forest of masts and sailcloths stretching across a bay, until the shore itself seemed to have grown tall and strange. He was not always a kind man, this king, but he carried his weight, and the weight of his inheritance, with a kind of grim seriousness that was in its own way a form of devotion. And there was a prince, young and beautiful as the story tells it, who crossed the sea with gifts in hand, and arrived at a court where hospitality was law, where wine was poured and songs were sung, and the days passed in the amber warmth of feasting. What happened in those days, what passed between a guest in a host's household, between a prince and a queen who was said to be the most beautiful woman in the known world, is something the story holds with a kind of deliberate gentleness, neither fully explaining nor condemning, leaving space for all the complex and human possibilities of longing and choice and circumstance. And then the ships moved, and the world shifted, and the long coast of Asia rose on the horizon like something inevitable. The beach at Troy became a world unto itself, a city made of tents and fires, and the endless low sound of men waiting, talking, sharpening blades, and watching the walls of a city that would not fall. They cooked simple meals in the morning and tended their ships with the careful attention of people who knew that those dark-hulled vessels were their only road home. They prayed in the early light, pouring libations into the sand, watching the liquid darken and vanish, trusting that something heard them, that the gods who moved through the world like invisible weather were attending, as they always were, sometimes with love and sometimes with indifference, sometimes wearing the face of a stranger on the road. The gods themselves were never far away in that world, and it is one of the most beautiful and strange things about the story, that the divine and the mortal were understood to be so close, so entangled, that a goddess might stand beside a warrior in the dust of battle and turn a spear aside with nothing more than a breath, and that this was not considered miraculous so much as simply how things were. The gods argued on their mountain the way families argue, with old grievances and competing loyalties, and they intervened in the affairs of men with the casually enormous power of those who cannot die, and therefore cannot fully understand what it means to lose everything. And yet the men and women in the story knew. They knew, and they lived inside that knowledge the way we live inside our own mortality, most of the time without thinking about it, and then sometimes with a sudden and overwhelming clarity. Hector knew, walking through the streets of his city in the early morning, past the stone altars still fragrant with yesterday's offerings, past the market stalls and the temples, and the familiar faces of people who had known him since he was a child. He knew, when he lifted his small son in the light outside the Scaean gates, when the boy cried at the sight of his father's bronze helmet with its nodding horsehair crest, and he laughed and removed it and held his son against his chest and said the things that fathers say when they are trying to be brave for the people they love most. The sea was there in that moment, somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the plain, its sound barely audible, a soft and steady presence beneath everything. There was rage in the story too, enormous and consuming, the rage of a man who felt himself dishonored, who withdrew his tremendous gift of himself and let the silence of his absence press down on all those around him. But even in the tent of Achilles, in the long, unhurried evenings of his withdrawal, there was music, a lyre in his hands, old songs about heroes he would one day equal and surpass, and there was his companion beside him, patient, faithful, the kind of friendship that has no need to explain itself. And then the embassy came, lamplit and earnest, old men walking through the dark of the Greek camp with their carefully prepared words and their gifts, and Achilles listened, and the fire burned between them, and for a little while everyone sat in the warmth of that uncertain firelight, not yet knowing what would come. What came was grief, and grief is where the story turns most quiet, most human, most true. The grief of Achilles for the one he loved, so enormous it remade him, so enormous it swept him back into the war not with the brightness of glory, but with the dark weight of loss. The grief of a city for its greatest defender, watching from the walls, already feeling the shape of what would come. And then, in the deepest part of the night, something happened that the story offers as perhaps its most lasting gift. An old man walked alone through enemy lines, carrying gold and trembling, and knocked at the door of the man who had killed his son. And the man who had killed his son let him in, and wept with him. And for a little while there were no sides, no war, no rage, only two people in the lamplight sitting with the fact of loss, which is the thing that all of us, across all the years and all the distances, share most completely. The sea does not remember any of it, or perhaps it remembers all of it in the only way the sea can, as a continuous and indifferent presence, as sound and salt, and the particular quality of light on moving water in the late afternoon, when the sun is getting low and the shadows on the waves go long and blue. The Bronze Age cities rose and burned and were buried under centuries of silence. The names were preserved in song, passed from voice to voice through the dark, carried across the water in the minds of singers who performed them by firelight, for audiences who sat still and let the images wash over them, much as you have done these nights, in whatever quiet corner of the world you have chosen for your listening. And that is perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all, that a story sung on a Greek hillside perhaps 3,000 years ago, about people who may or may not have lived, about a war that may or may not have been fought, is still here, still moving through the air in the dark, still finding its way to ears that are ready for it, still carrying something that feels, despite everything, like truth. Let it rest in you now lightly, without any need to hold it firmly. Let the walls of Troy grow soft at the edges. Let the ships settle on the dark water. Let Hector's city go quiet, and the fires on the beach burn low, and the gods return to their mountain, and the sea do what the sea has always done, which is simply to breathe in and out, slow and endless and entirely without urgency. You have listened well. You have traveled far, and now the shore is here, and the night is full, and there is nothing left to do but close your eyes and let the wine-dark water carry you, very gently, into sleep.